In the depths of winter, some wounds never heal. Some memories never fade. For Dr. Riley Hayes, the Montana wilderness wasn't an escape, it was a sentence. Self-imposed isolation in her grandmother's remote cabin. 107 days of silence broken only by nightmares. Until the night a white horse appeared in the snow. Bloodied, wounded, impossibly old, with eyes that held more than animal intelligence. What connects a combat medic's broken past to a horse bearing the scars of military experiments? What secrets did Clara Hayes take to her grave, and why, after 50 years, has Echo finally come to find his rightful heir? Some bonds transcend time. Some connections defy science. Some truths are worth dying for. And in the howling silence of a Montana winter, the most dangerous journeys begin with a single hoofbeat in the snow. The explosion came without warning. One moment, Dr. Riley Hayes was bent over a wounded Marine, fingers pressed against a severed artery. The next, she was airborne, thrown backward by a force that seemed to suck all sound from the world. Heat washed over her skin as the makeshift medical tent disintegrated into fire and shrapnel. When her hearing returned, it came in fragments, screams, the staccato of gunfire, someone calling her name. Riley dragged herself to her knees, blood trickling from a gash above her eyebrow. Through smoke and dust, she saw Sarah, her field nurse, pinned beneath a collapsed support beam, arm outstretched. "Riley!" Sarah's voice cracked, her face ghostly beneath a mask of blood and soot. "The others, check the others." Riley's gaze shifted to the 3 wounded Marines she'd been treating. One lay motionless beyond help. The other 2 were still alive, one clutching a mangled leg, the other unconscious, but breathing. "I can get you out!" Riley shouted, scrambling towards Sarah. "Just hold on." Sarah's eyes darted towards something beyond Riley's shoulder. "No time? Another RPG, they're targeting the medical station. Get them out." "I'm not leaving you," Riley insisted, tugging at the beam. Sarah gripped Riley's wrist with surprising strength. "That's an order, Doctor. Save who you can." A decision made in seconds that would stretch into eternity. Riley looked from Sarah to the wounded, calculating impossible odds. Outside, shouting grew closer. Enemy combatants would reach them within minutes. "I'll come back for you," Riley promised, voice breaking. Sarah's smile was terrible in its certainty. "I know you will. Now go. It's our mission." Riley gathered the conscious Marine, first slinging his arm over her shoulder. As she half-carried, half-dragged him toward the rear exit, she cast one final glance back at Sarah. "Go," Sarah commanded. The second explosion came as Riley cleared the tent flap. The force of it lifted her off her feet, throwing her and the wounded Marine into a shallow irrigation ditch. Heat scorched her back, in debris raining down around them. When she rolled over, the medical tent was nothing but a column of flame reaching toward an indifferent Afghan sky. "Sarah!" The scream tore from Riley's throat, raw and primal. But there was no answer. There would never be an answer again. Riley Hayes jerked awake, a strangled cry dying in her throat. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place herself. Was she still in Afghanistan, surrounded by dust and death? The phantom smell of burning canvas lingered in her nostrils. Cold reality seeped in slowly. The rough-hewn log walls of her grandmother's cabin. The creaking of timber contracting in the Montana winter. Her own ragged breathing loud in the pre-dawn stillness. Her fingers were clenched around a morphine auto-injector, knuckles white. A military-grade medical tool she had no legal right to possess. Riley slowly uncurled her fingers, placing the injector back in the small medical kit she kept beside her bedroll. Her hand trembled, 5 years removed from combat, and still her body wouldn't obey simple commands. "Day 107, she whispered to the darkness. A ritual counting the days since she'd retreated to this mountain sanctuary. Since she'd chosen silence over the cacophony of civilization. Riley rose, favoring her right hip, where an Afghan IED had left its permanent signature. The cabin was cold, the fire in the cast-iron stove having died down to embers. She moved mechanically, rebuilding the fire, setting a kettle of snowmelt water to boil. The mundane task anchored her to reality, preventing her mind from drifting back to the burning tent, to Sarah's final moments. As the stove rekindled, casting wavering light across the cabin's interior, Riley caught her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. A stranger stared back, hollow-eyed hair, cropped military short, even now, years after discharge. The scar that ran from her left jaw to the hollow of her throat stood out livid against her winter-pale skin. Whenever her anxiety spiked, she found herself tracing it, a tactile reminder of survival. She turned away from her reflection and reached for the leather-bound journal on the rough-hewn table. In meticulous handwriting, she recorded day 107. 047 hours. Temperature, fire 10 hallucination index, 810. Increased dosage of prazosin ineffective. Auditory flashbacks, explosion. S's voice persist. The clinical notation distanced her from the emotional impact, transformed nightmare into data. It was a coping mechanism her military therapist would have recognized, one of the few she'd actually adopted from those futile sessions at the VA. Riley closed the journal and moved it to the cabin's main window, brushing frost from the glass. Outside, the world was a monochrome etching of white and shadow. 3 feet of snow blanketed the clearing around the cabin, pristine, save for the trails of deer and smaller creatures. Beyond, the Montana wilderness stretched unbroken to the horizon, pine trees bowing under the weight of snow. Bitterroot range, named for a flower that bloomed in adversity. How Clara Hayes had loved this place. Riley's gaze drifted to the photographs that lined the cabin walls. Her grandmother had been a formidable woman, lean and weathered, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets. In most images, Clara stood alone against the backdrop of mountains or forest. But in one, the centerpiece over the fireplace, she stood smiling beside a magnificent white horse, its mane catching the summer light. Riley had never met the horse. By the time she came to live with Clara at age 5 after her parents' deaths, there were no animals save the occasional visiting fox or marten. But Clara had spoken of the white horse often, especially in her final years. Echo knew things, she would say, her eyes distant with memory. Some souls just do. Riley had dismissed it as the sentimentality of an elderly woman. Now, alone in the same cabin surrounded by Clara's possessions, she wasn't so certain. There were nights when the wind seemed to carry the sound of hoofbeats, though no horse had traversed these slopes in years. The kettle's whistle pulled her from her reverie. She poured boiling water over instant coffee granules, the bitter aroma filling the small space. As she sipped the scalding liquid, Riley's gaze fell on the old military radio set in the corner, another of Clara's inexplicable possessions. On impulse, she crossed to it, checking that it was still connected to the solar battery pack she'd rigged last summer. The radio crackled to life, dials glowing faintly in the dim cabin. Riley adjusted the frequency to an emergency channel, more habit than hope. "This is Echo Base," she spoke into the handset, using the call sign she'd chosen when she first arrived. Broadcasting on emergency frequency, anyone receiving static answered as it had every morning for 107 days. Riley was about to switch off when a fragment of voice emerged from the white noise, too brief, too distorted to make out words. Her pulse quickened. "Repeat transmission. This is Echo Base. Do you copy?" More static than silence. Had she imagined it? Another symptom to log in her journal? Riley waited, counting heartbeats, but the voice, if it had been real, did not return. She replaced the handset and moved away from the radio. Beside it stood an ancient record player, another of Clara's treasures. Riley selected a vinyl from the small collection, Simon and Garfunkel's Sounds of Silence. As the melancholy notes filled the cabin, she felt a momentary connection to her grandmother. This had been Clara's favorite, played on evenings when she would sit by the fire writing in journals similar to the one Riley now kept. The song spoke of isolation, of words unheard, a fitting soundtrack to Riley's self-imposed exile. She sank into the worn armchair by the stove, coffee cooling in her hands, and let the music wash over her. Outside, dawn was breaking, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Another day to survive. The vent pipe for the wood stove had been smoking back into the cabin for 3 days. Riley finally decided to tackle it, more out of necessity than ambition. The sub-zero temperatures made outdoor work punishing, but the alternative was slow carbon monoxide poisoning, a fate that held a certain appeal on her darkest days, but one her medical training wouldn't allow her to ignore. She bundled up in Clara's old parka, still bearing the faint scent of pine and tobacco that Riley associated with her grandmother. The coat was too large, designed for someone taller, but it had weathered decades of Montana winters and would suffice. On the cabin's roof, Riley found the problem immediately: a bird's nest wedged in the chimney cap, now frozen solid. She chipped away at it with a screwdriver, fingers numbing despite her gloves. As she cleared the last of the debris, something metallic clinked against her tool. Curious, Riley extracted a small metal box from the nest. It was a weathered tin container there, the kind that might once have held cigarettes or small keepsakes. Its presence in a bird's nest was peculiar enough to warrant investigation. Back inside the cabin, hands thawing painfully by the stove, Riley examined her find. The tin's lid was partially melted, as though it had endured extreme heat. She pried it open with her knife, revealing contents protected by a watertight seal. Inside lay several items: a faded photograph, a half-burned letter, a fragment of what appeared to be a map, and a military insignia she didn't recognize. Riley spread them carefully on the table. The photograph showed a much younger Clara, perhaps in her 20s, standing beside a handsome military officer. His uniform placed him in the Vietnam era, his posture unmistakably that of career military. Between them stood a white horse, the same animal from the photograph above the fireplace. On the back, written in faded ink, Clara and Nathan with Echo. Silver Creek, 1967. Nathan. Clara had never mentioned a Nathan nor any military connection besides her late husband, Riley's grandfather, who had died before Riley was born. The letter was charred along one edge, rendering much of it illegible. Riley could make out fragments. Echo was trained to find, "If you're reading this, trust the horse. The project must never be completed. Coordinates to the lab are..." The rest was lost to fire. Riley frowned, puzzled by the cryptic message. What project, what lab, and who was this message intended for? The map fragment showed what appeared to be an old mining complex with handwritten notations in what Riley recognized as military grid coordinates. A section was circled in red with the notation Babylon entrance beside it. Finally, the military insignia, a patch she didn't recognize from her own service. It depicted an eagle clutching what appeared to be a scroll with the words Project Babylon 1968-1972 embroidered along the bottom. Riley sat back, mind racing. Clara Hayes had presented herself as a simple widow who chose mountain solitude after her husband's death. Nothing in the story she'd told suggested military connections or mysterious projects. On impulse, Riley retrieved Clara's journals from the bookshelf. She glanced through them and after Clara's death, but had set them aside, respecting her grandmother's privacy. Now she flipped through them with purpose, looking for any mention of Nathan or Project Babylon. Most entries were mundane weather observations, notes on wildlife, occasional reflections on aging. But Riley noticed something odd. Several months had pages torn out, leaving ragged edges in the binding. The missing sections created gaps in the narrative, all from the late 1960s and early 1970s. The same time frame as the patch. Riley was about to delve deeper when a sound from outside froze her in place. A crunch of snow, too heavy to be wildlife. She remained motionless, listening intently. Another sound followed, the unmistakable soft nickering of a horse. The Winchester rifle felt solid in Riley's hands as she eased the cabin door open just enough to peer into the swirling snow. Night had fallen while she examined Clara's papers, and now the forest was a tapestry of black and silver moonlight reflecting off fresh powder. Her breath clouded before her face crystallizing in the sub-zero air. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar clearing, the woodpile beside the porch, the line of pines standing sentinel at the forest's edge. Then movement caught her eye. A pale shape collapsed at the bottom of the porch steps. Riley's training took over. She swept the perimeter, clearing corners with the rifle barrel, ensuring there were no other presences lurking in the darkness. Satisfied she was alone, she approached the fallen form. A horse white as the snow it lay upon, save for the dark stains spreading across its flank. The animal's sides heaved with labored breath, steam rising from flared nostrils into the freezing air. Riley lowered her rifle, medical instinct supplanting caution. The horse was severely injured. A deep laceration ran along its right hind leg, and an ugly burn mark scarred its side. The burn was deliberate, shaped like a half-moon, the kind of cruelty that made Riley's stomach clench. "Easy," she murmured, approaching slowly with her palm extended. The horse lifted its head weakly, regarding her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Its eyes were dark, reflecting the cabin lights like twin stars. Around its neck hung a weathered leather collar, nearly rotted through. Riley gently turned the attached metal tag. A single word was etched into the tarnished surface: Echo. A coincidence that couldn't be coincidence. The same name from Clara's photograph, the same white coat. But impossible, that photo was more than 50 years old. The horse, Echo, shuddered violently, blood seeping into the snow beneath him. Whatever mystery surrounded this animal would have to wait. Right now, it needed medical attention, or it would die here on her doorstep. All right, Riley decided, holstering her sidearm. Let's get you somewhere warm. The storage shed behind the cabin was her best option, a sturdy structure with enough space for a horse to lie down. Riley worked methodically, spreading old blankets on the floor, hauling water from the cabin, gathering her medical supplies. Military triage applied to any patient, human or animal. Getting Echo to the shed was the greater challenge. The horse tried to rise at her urging but collapsed after a few steps, the injured leg unable to bear weight. Riley pressed her shoulder against Echo's barrel, taking some of the burden. "Lean on me," she encouraged, voice soft but firm, one step at a time. It took nearly an hour of slow progress, each placement of Echo's hooves leaving crimson crescents in the snow. By the time they reached the shed, both were exhausted, breath coming in ragged plumes of vapor. Under the harsh light of a battery-powered lantern, Riley assessed the damage properly. The leg wound was deep, but clean, a knife or sharp tool rather than a natural injury. The burn along Echo's ribs was crusted and inflamed, days old at least. Older scars crisscrossed the horse's hide, speaking of sustained abuse. As Riley cleaned the leg wound with the antiseptic, she felt a strange crawling sensation along her spine. Echo was watching her, gaze unwavering. There was something in those dark eyes, recognition, perhaps, or expectation, that unsettled her. "What happened to you, she asked, not expecting an answer. "Who did this?" Echo's ears pricked forward at her voice. As Riley bandaged the leg, her fingers brushed against something embedded beneath the horse's skin near the shoulder. A foreign object, small and hard. Frowning, Riley retrieved a scalpel from her kit and probed gently. What she extracted sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter night. A microchip, not the kind used for standard pet identification. This was military-grade technology similar to tracking devices she'd seen in specialized equipment in Afghanistan. A serial number was etched into its surface, BPN 67 ECH03. Riley stared at the chip, then at Echo. The implications were disturbing. Someone had been tracking this animal, someone with access to restricted technology. Echo shifted ears, suddenly alert. Outside, the wind had died down, creating an unnatural stillness. In that silence, Riley heard what had alarmed the horse, the distant but unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. Someone was in the forest. Someone who might be looking for a white horse. Riley extinguished the lantern, plunging the shed into darkness. She moved to the doorway, drawing her sidearm. Nothing moved in the moonlit clearing, but her instincts, honed by 2 tours in combat zones, screamed danger. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Echo, though the command seemed absurd. The horse's ears remained pricked toward the forest, body tense despite its injuries. Riley made a decision. She couldn't leave Echo alone, wounded and vulnerable. But bringing a horse into her cabin was equally impossible. She would need to stay in the shed tonight, standing guard until she could better assess the threat. She retrieved a rifle, extra ammunition, a thermal blanket, and a thermos of coffee from the cabin. As she settled against the shed wall, rifle across her knees, Echo lowered his head to her shoulder, breath warm against her neck. "We'll figure this out," Riley promised, unsure if she was reassuring the horse or herself. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes that would cover any tracks by morning. Riley checked her watch, 0203 hours. A long night stretched ahead, filled with questions that had no obvious answers. Who had injured Echo and why? How was this horse connected to Clara's mysterious past? What was Project Babylon? And why had her grandmother kept it secret? As if sensing her turmoil, Echo settled beside her, warmth radiating from his large body. For the first time in 107 nights, Riley Hayes would not sleep alone in the Montana wilderness. Dawn broke with the crystalline clarity unique to mountain winters. Riley, who had dozed fitfully between perimeter checks, rose stiffly from her position against the shed wall. Echo had remained beside her through the night, alert to every sound from the forest. The horse looked marginally better this morning. The bleeding had stopped, and though Echo still favored the injured leg, he could stand without trembling. Riley changed the bandages, applied more antibiotic salve to the burn, and offered a handful of oats she'd found in a forgotten bin. "You're tough," she told the horse, noting the steady improvement. "Military grade, I'd say." Echo's ears flickered at her words, almost as if he understood. His dark eyes followed her movements with that same unsettling intelligence she'd noticed the night before. Riley needed answers. The microchip, the collar with Echo's name, The rifle shot in the night, none of it was coincidence. She returned to the cabin to retrieve Clara's journals and the items from the tin box. As she crossed the clearing, movement at the forest's edge caught her eye. A figure stepped from the shadow of the pines, a man tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in winter camouflage. Riley dropped to a crouch behind the woodpile, drawing her sidearm. The man moved with the measured confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He wore a Forest Service parka, but something about his posture suggested military training. He approached the cabin directly, no attempt at stealth. When he reached the porch, he knocked firmly on the door. "Forest Service," he called. "Anyone home?" Riley remained hidden, assessing. If he were legitimate Forest Service, he would have come in a marked vehicle. The nearest road was 5 miles away had he hiked in. "In this weather, I'm Ranger Marcus Reed," the man continued. "Just checking on residents after the storm. We've had reports of downed power lines." A transparent lie. The cabin wasn't connected to any power grid. It ran on solar panels and a backup generator. Clara had chosen isolation precisely to avoid dependence on utilities. Riley watched as Ranger Reed circled the cabin, peering through windows. He paused at the back door, testing the handle. When it didn't yield, he moved toward the shed where Echo was hidden. She couldn't allow him to find the horse. Something in her gut told her this man meant harm. "Can I help you?" Riley stepped into view, keeping her sidearm concealed behind her leg. Reed turned, startled but quick to compose himself. "Ah, hello there, Marcus Reed, Forest Service." He gestured to a patch on his jacket. "Just checking on folks after the storm." Up close, Riley could see inconsistencies in his appearance. The patch wasn't properly attached. His uniform had no name tag. Most tellingly, he wore a shoulder holster partially concealed by his jacket. "I appreciate the concern," Riley said, maintaining a neutral expression. "But as you can see, we're fine here." Reed's eyes narrowed at her use of we. "We, I was told only one resident was registered for this property. Clara Hayes." "My grandmother," Riley replied. "She passed last year. I'm Riley Hayes, the current owner." Reed nodded slowly, eyes scanning the property. "Sorry for your loss. Mind if I come in? Need to check that your heating system is up to code. Lot of fire hazards this time of year." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Riley countered. "I'm in the middle of repairs. Another time, perhaps." Reed took a step closer. "It's a routine safety check, ma'am. Won't take but a minute." The false civility in his tone set off alarm bells. Riley shifted her stance, subtly ready to draw her weapon if necessary. Before either could speak again, a commotion erupted from the shed. Echo was pawing at the door, whinnying loudly. Reed's head snapped toward the sound hand, moving instinctively toward his holster. "You have a horse, wasn't in the property records." "Recent acquisition," Riley said tightly. Reed's expression changed, predatory interest replacing the forced friendliness. "White horse by any chance?" "Why do you ask?" Riley's fingers tightened on her concealed weapon. "Had reports of a stolen animal in the area," Reed said, moving toward the shed. "Mind if I take a look?" "I do mind." Riley stepped into his path. "You haven't shown me proper identification, Ranger Reed, and I don't recall Forest Service having jurisdiction over livestock theft." Reed's facade cracked. His eyes hardened, his posture shifting to an unmistakable combat stance. "Listen carefully, Dr. Hayes. Yes, I know who you are. That animal is government property, and I'm authorized to recover it by any means necessary." The use of her title, not public knowledge since her discharge, confirmed her suspicions. This man was no forest ranger. "I think you should leave," Riley said, bringing her sidearm into view. "Now." Reed's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake. You have no idea what you're involved in." "I'm not involved in anything," Riley countered. "I'm a private citizen on private property and you're trespassing." Reed's hand moved toward his holster again, but Riley was faster. Her military training hadn't dulled with time. "Don't," she warned, her weapon now leveled at his chest. "Whatever you're here for, it's not worth dying over." For a tense moment, Reed seemed to calculate his odds. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his hands. "This isn't over," he said, backing away. "That horse doesn't belong to you, and neither does whatever Clara Hayes left behind." Riley maintained her aim until Reed disappeared into the tree line. Only when she was certain he was gone did she lower her weapon, heart pounding with adrenaline. Behind her, Echo continued to paw frantically at the shed door. Riley hurried to open it, expecting the horse to bolt given the opportunity. Instead, Echo pushed past her and headed straight for the cabin, moving with surprising speed despite his injuries. "Echo, wait!" Riley called, following in confusion. The horse stopped at the cabin's rear entrance, striking the door with his hoof. When Riley didn't immediately open it, he repeated the action more insistent. "What is it?" Riley asked, bewildered by the animal's behavior. Echo's response was to strike the door a third time, then turn to fix her with an expectant stare. Unnerved but curious, Riley opened the door. Echo shouldered his way inside, an absurd sight, this massive animal navigating the cramped confines of the cabin. He moved with purpose straight to a corner of the main room where the floorboards met the stone hearth. There, Echo pawed at a specific plank, nickering softly. Riley knelt beside him, examining the spot. The floorboard appeared identical to those surrounding it, but when she pressed on one edge, it tilted slightly. "Loose." "What have we here?" she murmured, working her fingers beneath the board. It came away easily, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside lay a metal box, military-issue waterproof, and secured with a combination lock. Riley lifted it out, turning it in her hands. No markings, no indication of its contents. Echo watched her intently, as if waiting for her to open it. "You knew this was here," Riley said softly, looking into the horse's intelligent eyes. How Echo's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice, but of course there was no answer. The combination lock posed a challenge. Riley tried Clara's birth date, then her own. Both failed. On impulse, she tried the numbers from Echo's microchip 6703. The lock clicked open. Inside the box lay two items: a military-grade USB drive, waterproofed and clearly decades newer than the photograph from the tin, and a leather-bound journal similar to Clara's others but unmarked on the spine. Riley opened the journal first. The handwriting was Clara's, but more hurried than in her other books, the entries dating from the final year of her life. The first page read simply, "If you're reading this, Riley, then Echo has found you. I always knew he would. What follows is the truth. I couldn't tell you while I lived. I'm sorry for the secrets, but they were necessary. Trust Echo. He will lead you to Nathan if Nathan still lives. After that, everything depends on you. Project Babylon must never be completed." Riley stared at the words, a chill settling in her bones that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. Before she could read further, the sound of vehicles approaching broke the silence, multiple engines growing louder. Echo's head jerked up, ears pricked toward the noise. He nickered urgently, pushing at Riley with his muzzle. She moved to the window. Through the trees, she could make out headlights, 3, possibly 4 vehicles moving up the logging road toward the cabin. Reed had returned, and he'd brought reinforcements. Riley made a split-second decision. She stuffed the journal and USB drive into her pack, along with her medical kit, ammunition, the Winchester, and what little food she could grab. Clara's final words echoed in her mind. "Trust Echo. He will lead you to Nathan." "Looks like we're taking a trip," she told the horse, securing her pack. "I hope you know where we're going." Echo seemed to understand. He moved to the door, waiting impatiently as Riley donned her winter gear. As they slipped out the back of the cabin, the first vehicle pulled into the clearing. Riley caught a glimpse of heavily armed men in unmarked tactical gear, definitely not Forest Service. Echo led the way into the forest, choosing a path that ran perpendicular to the logging road. Despite his injuries, the horse moved with confidence, picking a route that offered cover while remaining passable. Riley followed the weight of Clara's secrets heavy in her pack. Behind them, shouts echoed as the men discovered the empty cabin. Soon they would find the tracks leading into the forest. The hunt had begun. The forest embraced them in silence, the thick canopy of pines muffling sound and filtering the moonlight into ghostly patterns on the snow. Echo set a steady pace, his white coat almost invisible against the winter landscape. Riley followed close behind her, military training taking over foot placement, deliberate breathing controlled senses, hyper alert to any sound that might indicate pursuit. They had been moving for nearly an hour when Echo paused, ears pricked forward. Riley froze, listening. The distant rumble of engines carried through the still air, the search party following the logging roads that crisscross these mountains. "They're casting a net," Riley murmured. "Standard search pattern." Echo turned his head toward her eyes, reflecting pinpoints of moonlight. The intelligence in that gaze continued to unnerve her. This was no ordinary horse. They changed direction, moving deeper into the wilderness bend where no roads penetrated. The terrain grew challenging. Steep slopes, fallen trees, ravines that required careful navigation. Echo seemed to know exactly where to find passages through the seemingly impenetrable forest. As they climbed higher, Riley noticed something curious. Echo stopped periodically at certain trees, drawing her attention to marks carved into the bark. 3 parallel slashes, too uniform to be natural. Trail markers of some kind, but unlike any Forest Service or hiking trail blazes she recognized. They reminded her of markers used by special forces to designate safe routes in hostile territory. Was Clara military? Riley wondered aloud, examining one of the marks. Or was it Nathan? Ma? Echo nickered softly as if confirming her question. The horse continued forward, following the trail of marked trees with unwavering certainty. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the cabin. They paused in a sheltered hollow protected from the wind by a natural formation of rock. Riley checked Echo's bandages remarkably. The leg wound was already showing signs of healing faster than seemed possible. She shared a protein bar from her pack with the horse, who accepted it delicately from her palm. As Echo ate, Riley opened Clara's journal, hungry for answers. The first entries described Clara's worry that they had found her after decades of hiding. She wrote of moving the evidence to a safer location, of preparing Echo for his final mission. Echo is old now, but his memory's perfect. The treatments we gave him as part of the project ensured that. He remembers. Nathan remembers the way to the mine. If they take me, Echo will find you, Riley. He'll recognize your scent from the items I've given him. You share my blood after all. What I never told you about your parents' accident, it was no accident. David and Marie discovered something in the Babylon files, something even Nathan and I didn't know. They were going to expose it all. The night they died, they had arranged to meet a journalist. I should have told you the truth when you were older, but I was afraid. Afraid they would come for you too. So I hid us here in plain sight, just a grandmother and her orphaned granddaughter. I'm sorry for the lies, Riley. I hope someday you'll understand they were meant to protect you. Riley's hands trembled as she turned the page. Her parents' death had been ruled an accident, a car crash on an icy mountain road. She had been 5 years old, asleep at a neighbor's house when the police came. Clara had appeared the next day to claim her a grandmother she barely knew, and they had moved to this isolated cabin shortly after. The journal continued describing Project Babylon in fragmented references, a military experiment begun during the Vietnam War involving animals and some kind of enhanced communication. Clara and Nathan had been among the project scientists. Echo had been one of their test subjects. The connection we established was beyond anything we anticipated. Echo doesn't just understand commands, he comprehends complex concepts, remembers faces decades later, can follow multi-stage instructions. But what the military wanted was control, not communication. They perverted the research, turned it toward weapon development. Nathan discovered they were testing the serum on POWs, then on children. That's when we took the evidence and ran. They caught Nathan, reported him killed in action. I escaped with Echo in the original formula. Your parents were second-generation researchers on the project. They thought they were developing a therapeutic application, never knew the military's true purpose until they accessed the classified files. Riley closed the journal, mind reeling. If what Clara wrote was true, then her entire understanding of her family history was a fabrication. Her parents hadn't died by accident. Clara wasn't just a reclusive widow. And Echo was, what? A genetically modified military experiment. She looked at the horse, who stood sentinel at the edge of their shelter, ears constantly moving, scanning for threats. Echo met her gaze, and in that moment, Riley felt something, a whisper of connection, like a door opening, just a crack in her mind. Who are you? She asked softly. Echo approached, lowering his head to her shoulder. His breath was warm against her neck, his presence somehow comforting, despite the impossibility of what Clara's journal suggested. Riley reached up to stroke his muzzle. We need to find Nathan, don't we? Is he still alive? Echo's ears pricked forward at Nathan's name. He turned, looking deeper into the mountains with clear intent. All right, Riley said, repacking her supplies. Lead on. They continued through the day, following Echo's lead and the mysterious trail markers. The horse moved with growing urgency, stopping less frequently to rest. As afternoon waned, they began to descend into a narrow valley Riley didn't recognize from any of her previous explorations around the cabin. The trail markers grew more frequent here, and Riley noticed other signs, old boot prints preserved under overhanging rocks, a rusted tin can, the remnants of a campfire long cold. Someone had traveled this way repeatedly, maintaining the trail. Echo paused at the crest of a ridge, nickering softly. Below, nestled in a hollow surrounded by ancient pines, stood a small log cabin. Unlike Riley's relatively well-maintained dwelling, this structure sagged with age and neglect. The roof bowed dangerously under its burden of snow, and one window was boarded over. Yet there were signs of habitation. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, and the snow around the front door was trampled into muddy slush. "Is that where Nathan is?" Riley whispered. Echo bobbed his head in what seemed an unmistakable affirmative. Riley studied the cabin through her field glasses. No vehicles visible, no movement at the windows. The place had a forgotten quality, as if the forest were slowly reclaiming it. What caught her attention, however, was the front door secured with a heavy chain and padlock, not the arrangement of someone concerned about keeping intruders out. This was meant to keep someone in. "This isn't right," Riley murmured. Echo pawed the ground impatiently, clearly eager to approach the cabin. "Wait," Riley cautioned. "We need to be smart about this." She surveyed the surrounding area, noting potential cover lines of site escape routes, the automatic assessment of a combat veteran. Nothing suggested an ambush or surveillance, but Riley had learned the hard way that appearances could deceive. "Circle wide," she decided. "Check for any signs of Reed or his people." They approached indirectly, using the trees for cover. As they drew closer, Riley detected a sour odor beneath the wood smoke, the unmistakable smell of sickness and unwashed humanity. At the cabin's rear, a small window stood unboarded. Riley peered inside, then recoiled at what she saw. The interior was dim, lit only by a failing fire and a small stove. A single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom. And on a narrow cot against the far wall lay a man, emaciated and gray-haired, one wrist shackled to the metal bed frame. "Jesus Christ," Riley breathed. Echo nickered urgently, pushing at her shoulder. Riley made her decision. She tried the rear door, locked from the inside with a simple bolt. Using her knife, she managed to slip the latch through a gap in the weathered frame. The door swung open on protesting hinges. The stench of illness and confinement washed over her, all too reminiscent of field hospitals in Afghanistan. Riley entered cautiously, rifle ready. Echo followed, squeezing his large frame through the door with surprising delicacy. The man on the cot didn't stir at their entrance. Up close, Riley could see how wasted he was, cheekbones sharp beneath paper-thin skin, silver hair lank and unwashed. The shackled wrist was raw and infected, the skin beneath the metal cuff abraded to bleeding. Medical training took precedence over caution. Riley set her rifle aside and pressed fingers to the man's throat, finding a weak but steady pulse. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, voice pitched low. The man's eyelids fluttered. When they opened, revealing milky blue irises clouded with cataracts, Riley felt a shock of recognition. Though aged and ravaged by time and hardship, the face matched the young officer from Clara's photograph. "Nathan Porter," she asked. The man's cracked lips parted. His voice emerged as a whisper, barely audible. "Who?" "I'm Riley Hayes," she said, already reaching for her medical kit. "Clara's granddaughter." At Clara's name, a tremor passed through Nathan's frail body. His free hand lifted trembling to touch Riley's face. "Eyes," he murmured. "Her eyes." Echo pushed forward, nickering softly. The sound seemed to penetrate Nathan's confusion. His gaze shifted to the horse, and something like recognition flickered across his features. "Echo," he breathed. "You found me." Riley worked as they spoke, assessing Nathan's condition with practiced efficiency. Severe dehydration, malnutrition. The wrist infection was serious but not yet systemic. He was in a weakened state, but not critical. Someone had been providing minimal sustenance. "Who did this to you?" she asked, breaking a lock-picking tool from her kit to work on the shackle. Nathan's gaze drifted, focus slipping. "Daniel, my nephew, wants the files, the serum." "Daniel Porter," Riley pressed, remembering Clara's journal. "He works for the military." "Helix," Nathan managed. "Private now. Weapons, development." The shackle clicked open. Riley gently removed it, wincing at the damaged skin beneath. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it in gauze. "I need to get you out of here," she said, already calculating the challenges. Nathan was too weak to walk far, especially in the deep snow. Echo couldn't carry both of them. and Reed's people were likely still searching the area. Nathan gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Files," he rasped. "In the mine. Must destroy. Before Daniel finds." "What files? What mine?" Riley asked, but Nathan's energy was fading. "Babylon," he whispered. "The children, what we did to them." His eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming him. Riley checked his pulse again, stable but weak. She needed to get fluids into him, warm him properly, give him time to regain strength. Echo stood watch by the door, ears constantly moving alert to any approach. The horse's presence was oddly reassuring, as if having a second set of eyes and ears. Riley built up the fire in the small stove, melted snow for water, and mixed it with electrolytes from her medical kit. She roused Nathan enough to swallow small sips, supporting his head with gentle hands. As she worked, she absorbed the reality of what she'd found. Nathan Porter-Clara's long-lost love imprisoned in a remote cabin. A mysterious project involving military experiments on animals and possibly humans. Her parents' accident connected to whatever secrets they had discovered. And at the center of it all, Echo, a horse with capabilities that defied conventional understanding. "What have I stumbled into?" Riley murmured. Echo approached, resting his muzzle against her shoulder in what felt like a gesture of comfort. In that moment of contact, Riley experienced a flash of something foreign, a sensation of running through forest, of searching endlessly, of loyalty that transcended decades. She jerked back, startled. The impression vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving her wondering if she'd imagined it. "Did you just—" she began, then shook her head. Stress and exhaustion were affecting her judgment. Outside, the short winter day was fading into dusk. Riley secured the cabin as best she could, preparing for a night of vigilance. Whatever Nathan knew about Project Babylon, whatever Clara had been protecting all these years, it had cost lives and freedom. Reed and his people wouldn't give up easily. As darkness settled over the forest, Riley positioned herself by the cabin's single-window rifle across her knees. Echo lay near Nathan's cot, a silent guardian. The old man slept fitfully, occasionally murmuring names and fragments of sentences. "Clara, the children." Echo remembers. Riley opened Clara's journal again, searching for more pieces to this puzzle. The later entries grew increasingly paranoid, describing Clara's certainty that she was being watched. "I've seen the same car pass the road twice this week. There was a man at the general store asking questions about me. After 50 years, they've finally found us. I've moved everything to the hiding place. Echo is ready. I've made sure he remembers Riley's scent. If you're reading this, Riley, I'm probably gone. Don't trust anyone from Helix Corporation or anyone claiming military authority. The original Babylon files are hidden in the old mine shaft where Nathan and I worked. Echo knows the way. The USB contains my personal records, everything I could document about the project and what really happened to your parents. Trust Echo. He's more than he appears. The serum we developed created a connection we never fully understood. He'll guide you, protect you if he can. I'm sorry to place this burden on you, but you're stronger than you know you have, both your mother's brilliance and your father's courage, and perhaps something more." The final entry was dated just 3 days before Clara's death, from what the doctors had called natural causes, a heart attack in her sleep. "I dreamed of Echo last night. In the dream, he was leading Riley through the forest toward the mine, toward Nathan. When I woke, I felt at peace for the first time in decades. Whatever happens now, I've done all I can to protect the truth. The rest is in Riley's hands. To my granddaughter, if you're reading this, I love you. I always have. Forgive me for the secrets. They were meant to keep you safe." Riley closed the journal, tears pricking at her eyes. Clara had carried these secrets alone for decades, preparing for a moment she wouldn't live to see. In the dim light of the cabin, Riley studied Echo's profile. The horse stood motionless, a pale sentinel against the darkness, embodying a mystery she was only beginning to comprehend. "What are you, she whispered. Echo turned to look at her, and in the depths of those dark eyes, Riley saw something that transcended animal intelligence. A presence, a consciousness, watching her from behind that equine gaze. A sharp pain lanced through Riley's temple, causing her to wince. With it came a fleeting impression. Not words exactly, but a sense of urgency of time running short. Before she could process the sensation, a sound outside snapped her to alertness. The crunch of tires on snow. The low rumble of an engine approaching. Someone had found them. "We need to move," Riley whispered, gathering her supplies with practiced efficiency. Now. Echo was already alert, ears pricked toward the sound of the approaching vehicle. Nathan stirred on the cot, too weak to rise without assistance. Riley helped the old man sit up at assessing their options. Nathan couldn't travel far or fast, certainly not through deep snow in his condition. But staying meant capture or worse. Daniel, Nathan murmured, fear evident in his clouded eyes. He'll take the serum, continue the project. Not if I can help it, Riley assured him, supporting his frail frame as he struggled to stand. The headlights swept across the cabin windows as a vehicle pulled into the clearing. Riley peered through a gap in the boarded window. A black SUV with no markings idled outside its engine, cutting through the night silence. Two men emerged. One was Reed, the false forest ranger from earlier. The other was younger, tall, and athletic, dressed in expensive winter gear. He moved with military precision, but carried himself with the confidence of authority. Daniel, Nathan confirmed, his voice barely audible. Riley calculated rapidly. The rear exit was their only option, but they'd leave tracks in the snow, a clear trail for their pursuers. They needed a diversion. Echo, she said, turning to the horse. Can you create a distraction? Draw them away. The horse's ears pricked forward at her words. For a moment, Riley felt foolish. Was she really asking a horse to understand complex instructions? But Clara's journal had been explicit about Echo's unusual capabilities. To her astonishment, Echo bobbed his head once, then moved to the rear door, waiting for her to open it. Good boy, Riley breathed. Circle wide and loud, then find us in the forest. She opened the door and Echo slipped out into the night, his white coat quickly disappearing among the snow-covered trees. Riley turned her attention back to Nathan, wrapping him in the warmest blanket from the cot. We need to go while they're occupied with Echo. Nathan nodded weakly. The mine, he insisted, must reach the evidence. First, we need to get you somewhere safe, Riley countered, but Nathan's skeletal hand gripped her wrist with surprising strength. No time, he rasped. Daniel knows. I told you. He'll search the cabin, find Clara's map. A commotion erupted outside, the sound of Echo crashing through the underbrush, deliberately noisy. Shouts followed as Reed and Daniel spotted the horse. That's our cue, Riley whispered, supporting Nathan as they slipped out the rear door. The cold hit them like a physical blow. Nathan stumbled, his legs barely able to support his weight. Riley half-carried him, choosing a path that skirted the edge of the clearing, using the trees for cover. Behind them, she heard Daniel shouting orders, "Don't shoot the horse. We need it alive." Then Reed's voice urgent. The old man's gone, tracks leading into the forest. Their head start would be measured in minutes. Riley quickened their pace as much as Nathan could manage, heading deeper into the woods, where the thick pines might hide their trail. Nathan struggled to breathe in the cold air, each exhalation a painful wheeze. Riley knew he couldn't continue much longer without rest. They needed shelter, and soon. As if in answer to her unspoken need, Echo reappeared, materializing from the darkness like a ghost. The horse nudged Riley, directing her to follow him off their current path. You want us to go that way? Riley asked, uncertainty warring with the inexplicable trust she felt toward this strange animal. Echo nickered softly, insistent. All right, she decided. Lead on. The horse guided them to a formation of rocks half buried in snow. At first glance, it appeared to be a natural outcropping, but as they drew closer, Riley could make out a narrow opening, the entrance to a small cave. Perfect, she breathed. The space inside was just large enough for the three of them. Riley settled Nathan on a bed of pine boughs Echo had somehow gathered, then built a small, smokeless fire using techniques she'd learned in survival training. In the flickering light, she examined Nathan more thoroughly. His condition was worse than she'd initially assessed, not just malnourishment and dehydration, but possibly pneumonia developing in his lungs. Without proper medical attention, he wouldn't last more than a few days. Nathan, she said gently, offering him water. I need you to tell me everything you can about Project Babylon and what Daniel wants. The old man's eyes cleared somewhat in the warmth of the fire. Began in '67, he said, voice slightly stronger. Military wanted, communication with animals, intelligence gathering, scouts that couldn't be identified as American. And you and Clara were researchers, Riley prompted. Nathan nodded. Brilliant she was, developed a serum, created a neural bridge, Echo was first success, complete comprehension of human language, memory enhancement, but it went further. He paused, coughing painfully. Riley supported him until the spasm passed. Telepathic connection, Nathan continued. Not just understanding commands, actual thought transfer. Limited at first, but it grew. Riley thought of the strange impressions she'd experienced when touching Echo, that sense of foreign thoughts, emotions not her own. The military wanted weapons, Nathan went on. Not just communication, control, remote viewing through animal eyes, using them as delivery systems for bioweapons. His gaze drifted to Echo, who stood watch at the cave entrance. We refused, took the research original samples, went into hiding. But they found you, Riley said. Eventually, arrested me in '71, officially reported killed in action. Clara escaped with Echo in the files. And my parents, how do they fit into this? Nathan's expression softened. David and Marie, brilliant scientists, second generation of Babylon researchers. They thought they were developing therapeutic applications, neural bridges for paralysis victims. Never knew the military connection until too late. He reached for Riley's hand. They found something we'd missed. The serum didn't just create bridges between humans and animals. It altered human DNA in the process, created receptors, and those changes could be inherited. Riley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. What are you saying? Your parents realized the military was testing the serum on children. Nathan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Children of the original researchers, including you, Riley. The words hit her like a physical blow. That's impossible. I would remember. You were 3, Nathan said. The perfect age. Neural pathways still forming. They called you Subject RH7, the most successful human trial they'd ever recorded. Riley's head throbbed suddenly, a sharp pain behind her eyes. With it came a flash of memory, a sterile room, a kind-faced woman in a lab coat, a needle, and afterward the strange sensation of thoughts that weren't her own. That can't be true, she insisted, but doubt had already taken root. Your parents discovered the records, Nathan continued, planned to expose everything the night they died. It wasn't an accident. Riley finished Clara's journal entry, suddenly making horrible sense. Daniel doesn't know about you, Nathan said urgently, thinks the files are all that's left of Babylon. But you, Riley, you're living proof. The serum is in your blood. The connection is dormant, but it's there. Echo moved deeper into the cave, approaching Riley. The horse lowered his head, dark eyes meeting hers directly. He recognizes you, Nathan said. Not just as Clara's granddaughter, he senses the bridge. Riley reached out hesitantly, placing her palm against Echo's muzzle. The contact sent a jolt through her mind, a cascade of images, impressions, emotions, not her own. Forest paths seen from a different height, the scent of Clara's perfume, the patient wait through decades, the recognition upon finding Riley at the cabin. She jerked away, gasping. What was that? The connection, Nathan said, a hint of the scientist showing through his frailty. It's activating, just as we theorized. Emotional stress is the catalyst. Outside, distant voices carried through the still night air. Their pursuers were drawing closer, following their trail through the snow. They'll find us by morning, Riley said, practical concerns overriding her shock at Nathan's revelations. The mine, Nathan insisted. We must reach it. Destroy the original samples before Daniel finds them. You're in no condition to travel further, Riley objected. Then you must go, Nathan said. Echo will guide you. The entrance is hidden in the old Silver Creek mining complex 3 miles northwest. The files prove everything, the experiments, the cover-up, your parents' murder. The voices outside grew louder. Reed and his men were closing in. I won't leave you, Riley said, echoing words she had spoken to Sarah years ago, a promise she had broken then, with consequences that haunted her still. Nathan seemed to read her thoughts. Some battles can't be won by staying, he said gently. Sometimes the mission requires sacrifice. Echo nickered softly, pawing at the ground. The horse's anxiety was palpable, a pressure in Riley's mind that hadn't been there before. He feels them coming, Nathan said. The connection is strengthening. Riley made her decision. She gave Nathan her sidearm, placing it within easy reach. I'll go to the mine, get the evidence. Then I'm coming back for you. I'll hold them as long as I can, Nathan promised. Clara would be proud of you, Riley. So would your parents. Riley gathered her pack, checking the Winchester's ammunition. Echo and I will create a false trail first, draw them away from here. Nathan nodded, settling back against the cave wall. In the firelight, his resemblance to the young officer in Clara's photograph was suddenly apparent, the same determined set of the jaw, the same piercing intelligence in his eyes. Be careful, he warned. Daniel believes he's serving his country. That makes him dangerous. The most terrible acts in history were committed by people who thought they were doing right. Riley hesitated at the cave entrance, looking back at this man who had loved her grandmother, who had known her parents, who had carried secrets that had shaped her life without her knowledge. I'll be back, she promised. I know, Nathan said with a sad smile. Just like Clara always said you would be. Riley and Echo slipped into the night, leaving Nathan alone with the dying fire and approaching voices. As they moved through the forest, creating a deliberate trail to the east before doubling back toward the northwest, Riley felt a new awareness growing, a connection to Echo that transcended normal human-animal interaction. The horse moved as if they shared a single purpose, anticipating her thoughts almost before she had them. When they paused on a ridge to catch their breath, Riley placed her hand on Echo's neck and closed her eyes, focusing on the strange mental doorway that had opened between them. Show me the way to the mine, she thought deliberately. Show me what you remember. The response wasn't words, but a cascade of images. A younger Nathan and Clara following a stream that led to a cleft in the mountainside, a hidden entrance, obscured by fallen timber, a tunnel leading deep into the earth. Most vividly, Riley saw a metal door with a keypad and Clara's fingers inputting a code 73921. Riley opened her eyes, gasping. It worked, she whispered. I saw it. Echo nickered softly as if confirming her success. Behind them, shouts echoed as Reed's men discovered the false trail. They had perhaps an hour before their pursuers realized the deception. Let's move, Riley said, turning northwest. We have a mission to complete. As they made their way towards Silver Creek, Riley felt the weight of Clara's journal in her pack, Nathan's revelations in her mind, and the growing certainty that nothing in her life would ever be the same. Project Babylon had claimed her, parents separated Clara and Nathan, and now threatened to resurface through Daniel's ambitions. Whatever she had been before, soldier, doctor, recluse Riley Hayes was now something else, the inheritor of a legacy she never knew existed, and perhaps the only person who could prevent history from repeating its darkest chapter. Echo walked beside her, a silent companion whose presence anchored her to this new reality. Together they vanished into the forest depths, guided by memories older than Riley herself, memories of a love that had defied time and secrets that had waited decades to be revealed. Dawn painted the Montana mountains in hues of lavender and gold, the snow-covered peaks catching first light, while valleys remained shrouded in shadow. Riley and Echo had traveled through the night following the stream that would lead them to the abandoned Silver Creek mine. The horse moved with surprising stamina, despite his injuries, choosing paths that avoided the deepest snow. Riley's military training had prepared her for extended operations with minimal rest, but the revelations of the past 24 hours weighed on her like physical burdens. Her parents' deaths, Clara's decades of secrets, Nathan's imprisonment, and most disturbing of all, the possibility that she herself had been an unwitting test subject in Project Babylon. Subject RH7. She murmured the designation, sending a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Echo's ears flicked back at her voice. The horse slowed his pace, turning to regard her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Since their mental connection in the cave, Riley had been acutely aware of Echo's presence in her mind, not intrusive, but a gentle awareness, like knowing someone was in the next room even without seeing them. She reached out, hesitantly placing her palm against Echo's neck. Are you really understanding all of this? The response wasn't verbal, but a wave of what she could only describe as affirmation flowed through the contact. With it came a fleeting impression of Clara, younger than Riley had ever known, her speaking to Echo, in a laboratory setting, explaining concepts no horse should comprehend. Riley withdrew her hand, unsettled. This is real, she whispered. All of it. Echo nickered softly, then turned to continue their journey, urgency evident in his movements. Riley checked her watch. They'd been traveling for nearly 6 hours. If Reed and his men had discovered their ruse, they would be closing the gap. And Nathan? How long could he hold out in the cave? The old man's condition had been deteriorating rapidly. Without proper medical attention, exposure alone could kill him, never mind what Daniel might do to extract information. Riley pushed aside her worry, focusing on the mission. Find the mine, secure the evidence. Then she could circle back for Nathan. The terrain grew steeper as they followed the stream toward its source. Here the forest thinned, giving way to rocky outcroppings dusted with snow. Echo moved with increasing purpose, clearly recognizing landmarks invisible to Riley's eyes. You've been here before, Riley said, not a question but a realization. Echo's thoughts brushed against her consciousness, not words but impressions of time past, of following this same path alongside Clara and Nathan, of waiting outside while they entered the mine. The memories were fragmented, viewed through an animal's perception, but unmistakably real. They crested a ridge and Riley stopped short. Below them lay a narrow valley, and nestled against the far slope was the Silver Creek Mining Complex, a collection of weathered wooden structures surrounding the main shaft entrance. The site appeared long abandoned, the building sagging under decades of snow loads, the equipment yard littered with rusted machinery, half buried in drifts. There it is, Riley murmured. Echo's head came up sharply, ears pricked forward. A warning sensation prickled at the edge of Riley's consciousness. Someone's there, she asked instinctively, keeping her voice low. The horse pawed the ground, once a clear affirmative. Riley dropped to a prone position, pulling binoculars from her pack. She scanned the complex methodically, searching for signs of human presence. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just abandoned buildings slowly surrendering to nature's reclamation. Then a flicker of movement near the main shaft. A figure emerged briefly from the entrance, then disappeared back inside. The glimpse was too brief to identify, but the purposeful movement was unmistakably human. Daniel beat us here, Riley concluded grimly. But how he couldn't have known about this place unless Nathan had talked. The thought sent a spike of fear through her. What had happened after she and Echo left the cave? Echo nudged her shoulder, drawing her attention to another approach, a maintenance road that curved around the eastern edge of the complex, partially concealed by a stand of pines. Through the binoculars, Riley could just make out tire tracks in the snow. They drove in, she realized. That's how they got ahead of us. The situation had just become significantly more complicated. Riley had expected to enter the mine, retrieve, or destroy the evidence and leave before Daniel traced them here. Now she would have to infiltrate a location already occupied by hostile forces. She considered her options. The Winchester was a hunting rifle, accurate but limited in capacity. She had her combat knife and rudimentary medical supplies. Against an unknown number of armed men, a frontal approach would be suicide. Echo pawed the ground again, more insistent this time. When Riley looked at him, the horse turned his head toward a barely visible trail that skirted the western edge of the valley. Another way in, Riley asked. Echo's affirmation came as a gentle pressure in her mind. The horse remembered an alternative entrance, a ventilation shaft that Claire had shown him decades ago, an emergency exit if the main shaft was compromised. Show me, Riley decided. They descended the ridge on the valley's western side, moving from cover to cover. Echo led her to a dense thicket of evergreens that, upon closer inspection, concealed a narrow ravine cutting into the hillside. The ravine ended at a rock face that appeared solid until Echo nudged aside snow-covered brush, revealing a dark opening barely large enough for a person to crawl through. You've got to be kidding me, Riley muttered, eyeing the claustrophobic entrance. Echo projected a sense of certainty. This was the way Clara had shown him. Riley sighed and removed her pack, securing it to Echo's makeshift harness. Wait for me here, she instructed. If I'm not back in 3 hours, find help. The notion that a horse could understand such complex instructions would have seemed absurd days ago. Now, as Echo's acknowledgement brushed against her mind, it felt entirely natural. Riley extracted a small, tactical flashlight from her jacket pocket and approached the opening. The passage beyond was tight but navigable, sloping gently downward into darkness. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she began the descent into Silver Creek Mine. The tunnel was a natural formation, likely widened by the original miners and later adapted for ventilation. In places, rotting timber supports creaked ominously overhead. The air grew colder and damper as Riley progressed, the smell of earth and mineral deposits filling her nostrils. After 15 minutes of careful movement, the tunnel widened into what appeared to be an abandoned section of the mine proper. Old rail tracks for ore carts ran along the floor, disappearing into darkness in both directions. Riley paused, listening. Faint sounds echoed from somewhere deeper in the complex, the metallic clang of equipment, the murmur of voices too distant to distinguish. She needed to find the laboratory Nathan had described, the hidden facility where the original Babylon research had been conducted. Based on Echo's memories, it was located off the main shaft behind a security door that required a key code. Riley chose the direction that seemed to lead toward the center of the mine, keeping her flashlight beam low to avoid detection. The old tunnels were a maze of intersections and dead ends, many partially collapsed from decades of neglect. Several times she was forced to backtrack, searching for alternate routes. As she rounded a corner, voices suddenly became clear. Two men, their conversation echoing off the stone walls. Waste of time. There's nothing here but rocks and rust. Orders are orders. Porter wants every inch of this place searched. For what? The old man's probably delirious. 50-year-old secret labs, government conspiracies, sounds like something from a bad spy novel. Tell that to Reed. Guy took 3 rounds in Afghanistan protecting Porter. He believes even if you don't. Riley pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. The voices were approaching her position. She glanced around frantically for cover, spotting a collapsed section of wall that created a small alcove filled with rubble. She squeezed into the space just as flashlight beams swept around the corner. 2 men in tactical gear moved past her hiding spot, rifles held ready. They wore no identifying insignia, but their equipment was high-end, the kind used by private military contractors rather than standard military. "This section's clear," one said into a radio. "Moving to grid 7. "Copy that," came the response, slightly distorted by static. "Be advised, motion sensors detected something at the western perimeter. Could be wildlife, but stay alert." "Echo, they must have equipment is set up around the complex." "Roger, we'll finish this sweep and circle back." The men continued down the tunnel, their light fading into darkness. Riley waited until the sound of their footsteps disappeared before emerging from her hiding place. She needed to move faster now. Her presence, or at least echoes, had been detected. Following the direction the men had come from, Riley found herself in a more developed section of the mine. The walls here were reinforced with modern materials, the floor smooth concrete rather than rough-hewn stone. Electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, connected to lighting fixtures that had long since failed. At the end of this corridor stood what she'd been searching for, a heavy metal door with a keypad mounted beside it. The door itself was unmarked, but the keypad's design was distinctly military-grade, even after decades of disuse. Riley approached cautiously, examining the mechanism. Remarkably, a small indicator light still glowed on the keypad, suggesting some backup power source remained operational. She recalled the code from Echo's memory, 73921. Her fingers hovered over the keypad. If the code was wrong, or if the system had some security protocol, she might trigger an alarm. But there was no alternative. What she sought lay beyond this door. Riley entered the sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a series of mechanical clicks emanated from within the door, and it swung inward with a pneumatic hiss. Beyond lay Project Babylon's hidden heart. The laboratory was larger than Riley had expected, a cavernous space carved from the living rock and outfitted with equipment that would have been cutting edge in the late 1960s. Rows of examination tables, animal cages, and monitoring stations filled the central area. Along the walls stood glass-fronted cabinets containing specimens and chemical storage units. At the far end, a raised platform held what appeared to be an administrative area, desks, filing cabinets, and early-generation computers. Most disturbing were the photographs and diagrams lining the walls, images of animals with electrodes attached to their skulls, brain scans labeled with technical jargon, and clinical photographs of human subjects, many of them children. Riley moved through the space revulsion, warring with scientific curiosity. This was where it had all begun, the research that had created Echo's extraordinary capabilities, that had ultimately led to her parents' deaths, that had separated Clara and Nathan for decades. She approached one of the specimen cabinets, wiping dust from the glass. Inside, preserved in fluid-filled containers, were brain samples labeled with alphanumeric codes. Another cabinet held vials of amber liquid, the serum Nathan had mentioned, the neural bridge compound that enabled human-animal communication. Riley continued to the administrative area, searching for the files Nathan had emphasized were so crucial. The filing cabinets were locked, but the mechanisms were simple, nothing a combat medic with lock-picking training couldn't handle. Inside the first cabinet, she found personnel files, dossiers on the scientists involved in Project Babylon. She recognized Clara's name, immediately pulling the thick folder. Inside were performance evaluations, security clearances, and personal notes from supervisors. One document caught her attention, a memorandum expressing concern about Dr. Hayes's growing ethical objections to the project's military applications. The next cabinet contained research protocols and experimental data, hundreds of pages documenting the development of the serum, its effects on various animal species, the gradual refinement that led to successful neural bridging. The clinical detachment of the language couldn't disguise the horrific nature of many experiments. In the third cabinet, Riley found what she was looking for, a section labeled Human Trials. With trembling hands, she withdrew a folder marked RH7. Inside was her own history recorded in cold scientific terminology. Photographs of herself as a toddler, electrodes attached to her small head. Charts tracking brain activity before and after serum administration. Notes on her exceptional receptivity to the neural bridge effect. A wave of nausea swept through Riley as she read the clinical descriptions of how researchers had injected her, a 3-year-old child, with experimental compounds, monitoring her as she formed telepathic connections with laboratory animals. According to the notes, she had demonstrated the strongest response of any human subject, establishing lasting neural bridges that persisted even after the serum should have metabolized. One notation in particular sent ice through her veins. Subject RH7 exhibits genetic markers suggesting permanent integration of the serum compounds with her DNA. Recommend long-term monitoring and potential harvesting of genetic material for second-generation serum development. They had intended to use her as a breeding stock for the next phase of the project. Another folder contained what appeared to be her parents' research, the therapeutic applications they had been developing using the Babylon data. Their notes documented growing horror as they discovered the truth about the project's origins and their daughter's involvement. The final entry, dated 2 days before their deaths, outlined their plan to meet with a journalist from the Washington Post, bringing evidence of military experimentation on children without parental consent. They never made that meeting. Riley was so absorbed in the documents that she almost missed the sound, a faint metallic click, from the laboratory entrance. She dropped to a crouch behind the desk, dousing her flashlight. Footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, deliberate and unhurried. "I know you're in here, Dr. Hayes," a man's voice called. "There's no other way out." Riley remained silent, assessing her options. The administrative area offered minimal cover. Her rifle was with Echo outside. She had her combat knife, but against an armed opponent, the odds were poor. "I'm not here to hurt you," the voice continued, closer now. "I just want to talk." A beam of light swept across the laboratory, illuminating dust motes floating in the stale air. Riley caught a glimpse of the speaker, the younger man she had seen with Reed at Nathan's cabin. Daniel Porter. "You've read the files by now," Daniel said. "You know what this place is, what happened here." Riley stayed motionless, barely breathing. "Your grandmother was a brilliant scientist." Daniel continued, moving methodically through the laboratory. "So was Nathan. They could have changed the world with their research. Instead, they buried it here, denying humanity its benefits because they couldn't see beyond their own moral qualms." His footsteps stopped at the base of the platform, holding the administrative area. "I know about you, Riley. Subject RH7, the most successful human trial in the program's history. Nathan told me everything before his unfortunate passing." Riley's blood ran cold. Nathan dead. The implication struck her like a physical blow. She had left him just as she had left Sarah in Afghanistan. Another failure, another life lost because of her choices. "It wasn't your fault," Daniel said, as if reading her thoughts. "The old man was dying anyway. Years of radiation exposure from the early experiments. We made him comfortable at the end." Riley didn't believe that for a moment, but grief would have to wait. Surviving the next few minutes took precedence. Echo found you just as Clara programmed him to, Daniel continued. Remarkable animal. The only surviving subject from the original trials. Do you know he's nearly 60 years old? The serum extended his lifespan far beyond normal equine parameters. Imagine what it could do for humans. His footsteps resumed climbing the steps to the administrative platform. Riley gripped her knife, preparing for confrontation. We're not enemies, Riley. We want the same thing: to understand what happened here. To use this knowledge for good. He reached the top of the steps, flashlight beam sweeping across the open files on the desk. Riley tensed, ready to spring. I know you can hear me, Daniel said softly. I know you've formed a connection with Echo. You've experienced it yourself, the bridge between minds. Think of the possibilities. Communication with animals is just the beginning. The therapeutic applications alone could revolutionize medicine. Riley remained silent, but her mind was racing. What did Daniel really want? If he had the files, if Nathan was dead, why this attempt at persuasion? Helix Corporation isn't the military, Daniel continued. We're a private research firm specializing in next-generation medical technology. Yes, we have defense contracts, who doesn't in this industry, but our primary focus is therapeutic applications. Exactly what your parents were working toward. He paused, setting his flashlight on the desk so that it illuminated the space between them. In that moment, Riley saw his face clearly for the first time, handsome, intelligent, with the same piercing blue eyes as Nathan. There was no weapon in his hands. Show yourself, Riley. Let's talk like civilized people. Riley made her decision. Keeping the knife concealed in her sleeve, she slowly stood from her hiding place behind the desk. Daniel showed no surprise at her appearance, merely a satisfied nod. Thank you. I was beginning to think we'd have to do this the hard way. Like you did with Nathan, Riley asked, her voice hard. A flicker of something remorse crossed Daniel's features. My uncle was a complicated man. Brilliant but paranoid. He wouldn't listen to reason. He was imprisoned and starved, Riley countered. That's not complicated, it's criminal. Daniel sighed. A regrettable necessity. We needed information only he possessed. The location of this facility, the original serum samples. I never intended him harm. Yet he's dead. As I said, he was already dying. The radiation damage was irreversible. Riley studied Daniel's face, searching for deception. What she saw instead was conviction, the absolute certainty of a man who believed his cause justified any means. What do you want from me? She asked. Your cooperation, Daniel replied simply. You're unique, Riley, the only living subject whose DNA fully integrated with the serum. With your help, we can perfect it, create a version without the side effects that plagued the original formula. Side effects like what? Neurological degradation, psychosis. Early test subjects who formed too many neural bridges experienced cognitive collapse. Their minds couldn't handle the input from multiple consciousness streams. Riley thought of Echo's presence in her mind, the gentle awareness that had been growing stronger since their first connection. Was that how it began? A subtle intrusion that would eventually overwhelm her own identity. That won't happen to you, Daniel said, reading her expression. Your brain chemistry is unique. It adapted to the serum from childhood. You're the key to the next phase. And if I refuse, Daniel's expression hardened slightly, I'd prefer your willing participation. But Helix has invested too much to walk away empty-handed. One way or another, we'll continue the research. The threat was implicit but clear. Riley tensed, calculating the distance between them, her chances in a physical confrontation. As if sensing her thoughts, Daniel raised a hand. Violence won't be necessary. I'm offering you a chance to complete your parents' work, to develop the therapeutic applications they envisioned, helping stroke victims communicate when they can't speak, allowing the paralyzed to form neural bridges with service animals. The potential is limitless. It was a seductive vision, exactly the kind that might have appealed to her medical training, her desire to heal rather than harm. But Riley had read the files. She knew the project's dark origins, the suffering it had caused. And the military applications, she challenged. Surveillance animals, biological weapon, delivery systems. Are those still on the table? Daniel's silence was answer enough. That's what I thought, Riley said. You talk about healing, but you're funded by people who see weapons, just like the original project. The world isn't black and white, Riley. Progress requires compromise. Tell that to the children in those photographs, she replied, gesturing to the clinical images on the laboratory walls. Tell that to Echo, who was tortured and experimented on. Tell that to my parents who died trying to expose the truth. Daniel's expression darkened. I had nothing to do with your parents' deaths. That was before my time. But you're continuing the work that killed them, Riley pressed. You're perpetuating the same system, the same justifications. A sound from the laboratory entrance interrupted their confrontation, the heavy tread of multiple boots, the mechanical clicks of weapons being readied. Sir, Reed's voice called. We've secured the perimeter. The horse has been contained. Echo. They had captured Echo. Riley felt a surge of panic, both hers and the horse's flooding through their connection. Daniel noticed her reaction. Your bond with the animal is remarkably strong, he observed. Another indication of your unique neurological profile. Riley fought to control her expression, to not reveal how deeply Echo's capture affected her. What happens now? Now we leave this place, Daniel said. Take the samples and files we need. You'll come with us to our research facility in Idaho. Better accommodations than my uncle enjoyed, I assure you. And Echo, the horse is valuable research property. He'll be well treated, studied, but not harmed. Riley didn't believe him for a second. Once they had what they wanted, the serum formula, her genetic material, neither she nor Echo would be necessary. They would become loose ends just like her parents had been. She needed to stall, to find an opening. Before we go, I want to see everything, the full scope of the project. No more secrets. Daniel considered her request, then nodded. Reasonable enough. The more you understand, the more likely you are to see the importance of our work. He gestured for her to precede him down the steps to the main laboratory floor. As they descended, Reed and two other men entered the chamber, weapons at ready. The horse is secured in the transport, Reed reported, sedated for the journey. Riley felt Echo's consciousness growing distant, foggy, the effect of whatever drugs they had administered. She fought down her rising panic. She needed to remain clear-headed if they were to have any chance. Daniel led her through the laboratory, explaining equipment and procedures with the enthusiasm of a dedicated scientist. Despite herself, Riley found the information fascinating. The technical brilliance behind the project was undeniable, even if its applications had been perverted by military interests. They stopped before a sealed door at the far end of the laboratory, different from the entrance they had used. This is where the most sensitive work was conducted, Daniel explained, entering another code into a keypad. The developmental stage of the serum before animal trials began. The door hissed open, revealing a smaller chamber beyond a secure storage facility lined with refrigerated containers. In the center stood a modern computer setup incongruous among the vintage equipment elsewhere in the facility. We've been downloading the original research data, Daniel explained, gesturing to the computer, digitizing it for analysis at our primary facility. Riley glanced at the screen, noting the progress bar indicating the transfer was nearly complete. Whatever window she might have had to prevent Daniel from acquiring the data was closing rapidly. And the original serum samples, she asked, playing for time. Daniel pointed to a refrigerated cabinet against the far wall, preserved in liquid nitrogen. Still viable after all these years according to our preliminary tests. Riley moved toward the cabinet, mind erasing. If she could somehow destroy those samples, at least part of the project might be contained. But with Reed and his men watching her every move, the chances seemed slim. A faint pressure touched her consciousness. Echo fighting through the sedation. Images flashed in her mind, the horse in a transport vehicle surrounded by armed men, struggling against restraints. But beneath the immediate situation, Echo was trying to communicate something else. A memory fragmented, but urgent. Clara standing in this very room decades earlier, her hands moving swiftly, placing something beneath a counter. A fail-safe, Echo's memories suggested. A last resort if the facility were ever compromised. Riley casually leaned against the counter, indicated in Echo's memory, her hand sliding along its underside. Her fingers found a small switch concealed where only someone specifically looking for it would find it. Impressive preservation, she commented, keeping Daniel's attention on the refrigeration unit while her fingers hovered over the switch. The technology was ahead of its time. Clara Hayes was a visionary, Daniel agreed. She understood the importance of their work even as she tried to bury it. Part of her must have known that someday someone would continue what they started. Riley met his gaze directly, or she knew someone might try to weaponize it again and left a way to prevent that. Before Daniel could process her meaning, Riley flipped the hidden switch. Immediately, alarms blared throughout the facility. Red emergency lights activated, bathing the laboratory in crimson. A computerized voice echoed from speakers hidden in the walls. Emergency protocol activated. Facility sterilization commencing in 2 minutes. All personnel evacuate immediately. Daniel's face transformed from confusion to fury in an instant. What have you done? Clara's insurance policy, Riley answered, backing away from him. She never intended this research to continue. She hid it as evidence, not as a resource to be exploited. Reed and his men looked to Daniel for orders, their weapons raised. Override it, Daniel shouted, rushing to the computer terminal. His fingers flew across the keyboard, attempting to halt the countdown. System locked, the computer responded. Administrative authorization required. Daniel turned to Riley, desperation replacing anger. The code? There must be an override code. If there is, I don't know it, Riley replied truthfully. 1 minute, 30 seconds to sterilization, the automated voice announced. We need to get out of here, Reed urged, already moving toward the exit. Whatever sterilization means, I don't want to find out. Not without the samples, Daniel insisted, moving to the refrigeration unit. He punched a code into its separate control panel, opening the sealed door. Inside, rows of vials glowed with amber liquid, the original Babylon serum. As Daniel reached for the samples, a new sensation flooded Riley's mind. Echo, fully conscious now, projecting a sense of urgent warning. With it came another memory. Clara explaining that the sterilization protocol involved not just data destruction, but the release of a neutralizing agent specifically designed to render the serum inert. Daniel, stop, Riley shouted. The sterilization process will destroy the serum. We need to leave now. 1 minute to sterilization, the computer intoned. Daniel hesitated, looking from the samples to the exit, indecision clear on his face. Reed made the choice for him, grabbing his arm. Sir, we're leaving. Now. The two mercenaries were already gone, prioritizing their own survival. Daniel allowed Reed to pull him toward the exit, but his eyes remained fixed on Riley. This isn't over, he promised. You've only delayed the inevitable. As they disappeared through the doorway, Riley faced her own decision. The files on the desk contained evidence of decades of unethical experimentation, the truth about her parents' deaths, the documentation of her own unwitting participation. But retrieving them would cost precious seconds she might not have. 45 seconds to sterilization. Echo's presence in her mind grew stronger. He had broken free of his restraints, was fighting his way back to her. Images flashed between them, the ventilation shaft she had used to enter a route back to the surface, the urgency of immediate escape. Riley grabbed the RH7 folder, her own file, and her parents' research notes, stuffing them into her shirt. The rest would have to be sacrificed. She ran for the exit, retracing her steps through the maze of tunnels. 30 seconds to sterilization. The main laboratory door had sealed automatically as part of the emergency protocol. Riley was forced to find another route following Echo's mental guidance through abandoned sections of the mine. Twice she encountered dead ends, forced to backtrack as precious seconds ticked away. 15 seconds to sterilization. She could feel Echo's panic mirroring her own as she scrambled through a partially collapsed tunnel. Ahead, she could see a faint glimmer of daylight, the ventilation shaft she had originally used to enter. 10 seconds? 9? 8? Riley launched herself toward the opening, clawing her way up the incline as the countdown continued. Behind her, she heard a series of pneumatic hisses as hidden systems activated throughout the facility. 3, 2, 1, sterilization protocol initiated. She emerged from the shaft into blinding daylight, just as a dull thud resonated from deep within the mine. No explosion, no fireball, just the release of the neutralizing agent Clara had engineered decades ago, designed to destroy the fruit of her own brilliant research. Echo stood waiting, his white coat streaked with dirt and blood from breaking free of his captors. The mental connection between them surged with relief at their reunion. In the distance, vehicle engines roared to life, Daniel and his men fleeing the scene. They had escaped with some of the data, but without the original serum samples, their ability to continue the project would be severely limited. Riley leaned against Echo's solid warmth, the adrenaline of their narrow escape giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. They had won this round, but at what cost? Nathan was dead. The evidence that might have exposed the full truth about Project Babylon was largely destroyed, and Daniel Porter would not abandon his quest so easily. Most troubling of all were the implications of her own file now secured against her chest. Subject RH7, a successful integration of the serum into human DNA. The connection with Echo was no accident. It was the activation of something that had been dormant inside her since childhood. "What am I?" she whispered. Echo's consciousness brushed against hers, offering not answers, but acceptance. Whatever she was, whatever she might become, she was not alone. As the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon, Riley mounted Echo's back. They needed to put distance between themselves and Silver Creek before Daniel regrouped. They needed safe haven time to process what they had learned to plan their next move. Above all, they needed to understand the legacy of Project Babylon, not just the scientific breakthrough it represented, but the human cost it had exacted. Clara Nathan, her parents, and countless unnamed test subjects had been sacrificed to its development. Riley would not allow their suffering to have been in vain. Echo moved beneath her with fluid grace, his stride lengthening as they left the mining complex behind. Through their strengthening bond, Riley sensed his determination matching her own. They were bound now by more than circumstance, united by a neural bridge that defied conventional understanding, by shared trauma, and by the promise of Clara's final mission. The Montana wilderness enfolded them, snow beginning to fall and gentle curtains that would cover their tracks. Behind them, Silver Creek Mine held its secrets once more, its darkest chapter closed but not forgotten. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the growing awareness that Riley Hayes was no longer simply a combat veteran seeking solitude. She had become something else, the living embodiment of Project Babylon's success, and perhaps the only person who could ensure it never claimed another victim. Night had fallen by the time Riley and Echo reached the relative safety of a hunting cabin Riley had discovered during her solitary explorations months earlier. The small structure was crude but serviceable, a single room with a wood stove, basic furnishings, and most importantly, no connection to any property records that might lead Daniel to their location. Riley built a fire in the stove, grateful for the dry wood stacked neatly against one wall. As warmth slowly permeated the cabin, she spread the salvaged documents on a rough-hewn table, examining them by the light of a battery-powered lantern. Her own file made for disturbing reading. The clinical detachment with which researchers, including Clara, had documented her responses to the serum was chilling. Phrases like optimal neuroplasticity and exceptional receptor development couldn't disguise the fundamental horror they had experimented on a 3-year-old child without informed consent, altering her neural architecture in ways that could never be reversed. According to the data, Riley had demonstrated unprecedented capacity for forming mental connections with test animals, not just receiving impressions as most subjects did, but establishing true two-way communication. Notes indicated that even after the serum should have metabolized out of her system, the neural pathways it created remained active, suggesting permanent alteration of her brain chemistry. More disturbing were the genetic analyses showing that the serum had somehow incorporated itself into her DNA. The implications were staggering, not just for Riley personally, but for any children she might someday have. The alterations would be heritable, passed down to future generations. Riley set aside her own file, turning to her parents' research. David and Marie Hayes had been recruited to Project Babylon's second phase in the early 1990s, tasked with developing therapeutic applications for the neural bridge technology. They had worked for years unaware of the project's origins or their daughter's involvement in the original trials. The notes documented their growing suspicions, their clandestine investigation into classified files, and finally their horrified discovery of Riley's designation as Subject RH7. The final entries outline their plan to expose everything, not just to end the project, but to secure proper medical monitoring for Riley and other affected children. 2 days later, they had died in what official reports called a car accident. Echo moved restlessly around the cabin, his presence in Riley's mind reflecting her own turmoil. Through their connection, she sensed his memories of Clara, The woman who had raised Riley after her parents' deaths, who had simultaneously protected her and kept vital truths from her. Had Clara known about Riley's participation in the trials? The files didn't make that clear. Perhaps she had only discovered the truth later, after taking custody of her orphaned granddaughter. That would explain her retreat to the isolated cabin, her vigilance, her careful preparations for a day when the past might resurface. Riley rubbed her temples where a persistent headache had been building since their escape from the mine. The mental connection with Echo, while invaluable during their flight, was taking a physical toll. Daniel had mentioned neurological degradation in early test subjects. Was that her future as well? Echo approached, lowering his head to nuzzle her shoulder. Through their bond came a sense of reassurance of shared burden. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Riley leaned against his solid warmth, drawing comfort from the contact. "We need to understand what's happening to me," she murmured, "and we need to stop Daniel before he recreates the serum." Echo's response wasn't words, but a series of impressions. Clara working in a small laboratory, not the mine facility, but somewhere else. A cabin similar to Riley's own with equipment hidden beneath floorboards. A place only Echo knew about. "Clara had another lab," Riley asked, focusing on the images. "At our cabin," affirmation flowed through their connection. Clara had continued her research in secret, working to understand the long-term effects of the serum, developing countermeasures should it ever be weaponized again. "That's why you came to me," Riley realized. "Not just to lead me to Nathan, but to show me what Clara left behind." Echo nickered softly, confirming her understanding. Riley considered their options. Returning to her cabin was risky. Daniel would certainly have men watching the property. But if Clara had hidden research there, it might contain crucial information about Riley's condition and how to neutralize whatever data Daniel had managed to salvage from the mine. "We'll rest tonight," she decided. "Head back at first light, approach from the north ridge, where the forest is thickest." As if in response to her decision, the headache intensified suddenly, a sharp pain that made her gasp. With it came a flood of sensory input, not just Echo's consciousness, but fragments of awareness from the forest around them. The night vision of an owl hunting nearby. The quick, nervous movements of a snowshoe hare beneath a fallen log. The distant howl of a wolf pack. Riley clutched her head, overwhelmed by the cascade of impressions. "What's happening?" Echo's concern washed over her, along with what seemed like recognition. He had seen this before in other human subjects. The serum's effects, dormant for years, were expanding now that the initial connection had been established. "It's getting stronger," Riley gasped, struggling to sort through the flood of sensory information. "I can feel everything." She staggered to the cabin's single cot, the room spinning around her. Echo followed, positioning himself protectively beside her. Through their connection, he tried to help her filter the input, showing her how to focus on one consciousness at a time, how to establish boundaries between herself and the awareness flowing into her mind. Gradually, the worst of the sensory overload subsided. Riley lay panting, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cabin's chill. The headache remained a dull throb behind her eyes, but the overwhelming cascade had receded to a manageable murmur of background awareness. "Is this what happened to the others?" she asked Echo. "The subjects who experienced neurological degradation?" The horse's memories provided incomplete answers. He had witnessed humans in similar distress, some who recovered and others who descended into what researchers termed cognitive collapse, their minds unable to maintain boundaries between self and other consciousness. "I need Clara's research," Riley concluded grimly, "before this gets worse." Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks and providing temporary cover. But Riley knew the respite would be brief. Daniel Porter had resources, determination, and now a personal stake in finding her. The only advantages she possessed were her military training, her growing connection with Echo, and whatever knowledge Clara might have left behind. As exhaustion claimed her, Riley's last thoughts were of Nathan, the old man who had suffered decades of separation from Clara, only to die just as the truth was finally emerging. She had failed to save him just as she had failed to save Sarah in Afghanistan. The weight of those failures pressed on her, even as consciousness slipped away. Echo maintained his vigil beside the cot, his presence steady in her mind even as she slept. Through their deepening bond, he shared not just his own strength, but the wisdom of decades of patient endurance learned through years of waiting, watching, remembering. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the wounded soldier and the ageless horse, bound by science that had transcended its creator's understanding, united in their determination to prevent history from repeating its darkest chapter. Outside the Montana winter, wrapped the small cabin in silence, the falling snow a blank page awaiting the next phase of their journey. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Montana wilderness, pale light filtering through clouds heavy with snow. Riley woke to the gentle pressure of Echo's consciousness against her own, a silent alarm more effective than any mechanical device. The headache that had overwhelmed her the previous night had receded to a dull throb, manageable but persistent. She sat up slowly, taking inventory of her condition. The sensory overload had subsided, but her awareness of the world around her remained heightened. Through the cabin's thin walls, she could sense the presence of wildlife, a fox denning beneath a fallen tree, birds sheltering from the cold, the distant movement of a moose through deep snow. These perceptions came not through conventional senses, but through a kind of mental radar, as if her consciousness had expanded beyond the boundaries of her own body. "Is this how you experience the world?" she asked Echo, who stood watchful by the cabin's single window. The horse turned to regard her, and through their connection came a complex impression, not quite words, but a conceptual understanding. Echo's perception was indeed different from human awareness, a blend of instinct and intelligence that processed information from multiple sources simultaneously. But the neural bridge created by the serum had modified his consciousness as well, adding layers of analytical thinking not natural to equine cognition. They had changed each other, these experiments. Neither fully animal nor fully human, but something unprecedented. Riley gathered the documents she had salvaged from the mines, securing them inside her jacket. Their next move was clear but dangerous: return to her cabin, locate Clara's hidden research, and find a way to neutralize the threat posed by Daniel Porter and Helix Corporation. The logistical challenges were significant. The cabin was likely under surveillance. Riley had limited ammunition for the Winchester and no means of communication with potential allies. Most concerning was her own unstable condition. The expanding neural capabilities could become a liability if another episode like last night struck at a critical moment. Echo sensed her concerns, projecting calm reassurance. Through their connection, he conveyed a route back to the cabin that would avoid likely observation points, utilizing terrain features that would mask their approach. He also shared memories of Clara training him to detect human presence at a distance, a skill that would prove valuable if Daniel's men were waiting for them. "You've been preparing for this your whole life, haven't you?" Riley murmured, running her hand along Echo's neck. The response was affirmative, a sense of purpose maintained through decades of waiting. Clara had spent years conditioning Echo for this eventuality, embedding instructions and information so deeply that not even time could erode them. They departed as the morning light strengthened Echo, moving with confidence through the snow-laden forest. Riley rode now, conserving her strength for challenges ahead. The horse chose paths that minimized their visibility, following stream beds where overhanging branches created natural canopies, traversing rocky outcroppings where they left minimal tracks. As they traveled, Riley focused on controlling her expanded awareness, using Echo's guidance to filter the constant influx of sensory information. She discovered she could extend her perception intentionally, reaching out to touch the consciousness of nearby creatures, or narrow it to a tight focus on immediate surroundings. The ability was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, a power she had never asked for, never been trained to manage. By midday, they had covered nearly 10 miles, circling west of Riley's cabin to approach from the direction least likely to be monitored. Echo paused on a ridge overlooking the property, ears pricked forward, senses alert. Riley extended her awareness, scanning for human presence. Almost immediately, she detected two minds, disciplined, focused, military-trained, positioned in the trees approximately 200 yards from the cabin. Daniel's men maintaining surveillance. "Just two," she murmured to Echo. "One at the north corner, one covering the main approach." Echo's response was a tactical suggestion, a route that would bring them to the cabin's rear, utilizing a seasonal drainage that ran behind the property. The guards' attention would be focused on obvious approach vectors, not on a difficult path that would be challenging even for experienced outdoorsmen. Riley agreed with the assessment. She dismounted, moving forward on foot to scout the proposed route while Echo waited at a safe distance. Using her enhanced perception, she navigated around the observers' positions, careful to make no sound that might alert them to her presence. The drainage ditch was, as Echo had indicated, a natural depression that had been deepened by spring runoff over many years. In winter, it formed a narrow channel, partially sheltered by overhanging embankments. Riley followed it to where it passed approximately 50 yards behind her cabin, well outside the sight lines of Daniel's watchers. She returned to Echo, confirming the viability of their approach. "It'll work, but we'll be exposed for about 20 yards between the end of the ditch and the cabin's rear door." Echo projected confidence he could cover that distance quickly enough to minimize risk of detection. They waited until mid-afternoon when the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow. Visibility would be poor during this transitional period, giving them additional cover. When the moment seemed optimal, they made their move. Echo carrying Riley swiftly down the drainage channel, his hooves muffled by the snow. At the channel's end, they paused, Riley scanning once more for any change in the observers' positions. Detecting none, she signaled Echo forward. The horse crossed the open ground in a controlled rush, powerful muscles propelling them toward the cabin's rear entrance. They reached the door without incident, Riley dismounting in a fluid motion that spoke of her military training. The door was unlocked. Daniel's men had already searched the interior. Riley slipped inside, Echo following with careful steps, his large frame barely fitting through the doorway. The cabin's interior showed signs of thorough searching, drawers pulled open, furniture, moved floorboards pried up in several places. They had been looking for exactly what Riley now sought, Clara's hidden laboratory. Echo moved deliberately to the stone hearth, nudging aside the braided rug that covered the floor there. His memories guided Riley to press specific stones in a pattern, activating a mechanism Clara had installed decades earlier. With a soft click, a section of the hearth's base swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Clever Clara," Riley whispered, impressed by her grandmother's foresight. The hidden space would have been undetectable to conventional searches, its entrance mechanism requiring specific knowledge to activate. Riley retrieved a flashlight from her pack and descended the stairs, Echo remaining above as lookout, their mental connection maintaining constant communication. The staircase led to a small chamber carved from the bedrock beneath the cabin, a space approximately 15 feet square, lined with shelving and dominated by a central work table. This was Clara's true legacy, a private laboratory where she had continued her research away from military oversight. Equipment that would have been cutting edge in the 1980s filled the space centrifuges, microscopes, chemical storage units, and an early generation computer system. Notebooks lined the shelves, each labeled with dates and cryptic coding systems. Riley moved to the computer, first powering it on with the generator Clara had installed. The system hummed to life, requesting a password. Riley hesitated, then typed Echo on the keyboard. Access denied. She tried Nathan, then Babylon. Both failed. Drawing on her enhanced connection with Echo, Riley sought the horse's memories of Clara working in this space. An image formed, Clara seated at this very computer, fingers moving across the keys, entering a sequence, RH7CLARA. Riley's designation combined with her grandmother's name. She entered the password, and the screen flickered, granting access to Clara's private files. The database was extensive, decades of research condensed into digital format. Riley focused on the most recent entries dated just weeks before Clara's death. These contained her final conclusions about the Babylon serum and its long-term effects, particularly regarding Riley. According to Clara's notes, the serum's integration with Riley's DNA had created a dormant potential neural pathways that would remain inactive until triggered by significant emotional stress or direct contact with another serum recipient. Echo's arrival at the cabin had been the catalyst, awakening capabilities that had lain dormant for 30 years. More concerning were Clara's observations about the progression of these abilities. The initial connection with Echo was only the beginning. As the dormant neural pathways activated, Riley's capacity for forming mental bridges would expand exponentially, potentially extending to any living organism within a certain radius. Without proper management, this expansion could lead to the cognitive collapse, Daniel had mentioned the inability to maintain boundaries between individual consciousness and the flood of external awareness. Clara had documented this outcome in several of the original test subjects, their minds essentially dissolving into the neural network they had created. But Clara had not abandoned her granddaughter to this fate. The final entries detailed her development of a stabilizing compound, a neurochemical regulator, that would allow Riley to control the expansion of her abilities without suppressing them entirely. Clara had created it specifically for Riley's unique genetic profile, a safeguard against the eventualities she had foreseen. Riley searched the laboratory, locating a small refrigeration unit concealed behind a false panel. Inside, carefully preserved, was a case containing several vials of clear liquid labeled RH7 stabilizer and a sealed package of auto-injectors similar to epinephrine pens. According to Clara's notes, the stabilizer would not permanently alter Riley's condition, but would provide temporary regulation of the neural expansion enough to prevent cognitive collapse while she learned to manage her abilities naturally. Each dose would provide approximately 48 hours of stability. Riley loaded one of the auto-injectors with the stabilizer, then hesitated. The compound was experimental, developed by Clara without peer review or clinical trials. Using it carried significant risks, but the alternative was potentially worse. Already, Riley could feel her awareness continuing to expand, the mental boundaries between herself and the surrounding environment growing thinner by the hour. If Clara's research was accurate, cognitive collapse might be only days away without intervention. Decision made, Riley pressed the injector against her thigh and activated it. The compound entered her bloodstream with a cold rush that spread rapidly throughout her body. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a radio being tuned to a clear frequency, the chaotic influx of sensory information resolved into organized patterns. The pressure in her mind eased, the headache receding completely for the first time since her initial connection with Echo. She could still sense the world around her with enhanced clarity, Echo's steady presence, the watchful minds of Daniel's observers outside the myriad small lives inhabiting the forest. But now these perceptions were controlled, accessible by choice, rather than flooding her consciousness unbidden. Relief washed through her, followed by renewed determination. With her mind clear, Riley returned to Clara's computer, searching for information that might help counter Daniel's plans. She found it in files detailing the neutralizing agent used in the mind's sterilization protocol, the compound Clara had engineered to render the original serum inert. The formula was complex but reproducible with the right equipment. More importantly, Clara had designed it to work not just on stored samples, but on active serum compounds within living tissue. According to her notes, the neutralizing agent could potentially reverse the genetic alterations caused by the original serum, effectively curing those who had been subjected to Project Babylon's experiments, including Riley herself. The implications were profound. This wasn't just a weapon against Daniel's attempts to recreate the serum. It was a way for Riley to reclaim her natural neurological state, to undo the unauthorized alterations performed on her as a child. But did she want that? The enhanced awareness, the connection with Echo, these were violations of her autonomy. Yes, but they had also become part of her identity. To erase them would be to sever the bond with Echo, to return to the isolation she had known before. Echo's consciousness brushed against hers, sensing her turmoil. The horse projected not advice but understanding. Whatever she chose, he would accept. Riley set the question aside. First, they needed to neutralize the threat Daniel posed. Decisions about her own condition could wait until that immediate danger had passed. She downloaded Clara's research onto a portable drive, including both the stabilizer formula and the neutralizing agent. Then she gathered additional vials of the stabilizer, securing them in her pack. As she worked, Echo's alertness spiked suddenly, a warning flowing through their connection. Movement outside. One of the observers was approaching the cabin. Riley quickly shut down the computer and ascended the stairs, securing the hidden entrance behind her. She positioned herself near a window, using her enhanced senses to track the man's approach. He moved with military precision, rifle at ready, not making a routine check, but responding to something that had drawn his attention. Had they been detected? Riley glanced at Echo, who stood motionless in the cabin's shadows, his white coat barely visible in the dim interior. The observer reached the cabin's front porch, pausing to listen before trying the door. Finding it unlocked, he pushed it open slowly, weapon leading. Riley had seconds to decide, attempt to hide or confront the threat directly. Echo's presence made concealment difficult, and if the man radioed for backup, their escape route would be compromised. She chose confrontation, utilizing the element of surprise. As the observer stepped into the cabin, Riley emerged from behind the door, striking with practiced efficiency at vulnerable points: throat, solar plexus, knee. The man went down hard, his weapon clattering away before he could fire. Riley secured him quickly, using zip ties from his own equipment to bind his hands and feet. A search of his tactical vest yielded a radio, extra ammunition, and a satellite phone, valuable resources for what was to come. "How many others are watching the property?" she demanded. The man glared up at her, refusing to answer. Riley didn't have time for extended interrogation. She extended her enhanced awareness, touching the edges of his consciousness, a technique she was only beginning to understand. She didn't attempt to control his thoughts, but rather sensed his surface emotions and immediate memories. Fear predominated, not of her, but of Daniel Porter. Images flashed through the man's mind. Daniel executing a subordinate who had failed him. The cold calculation in his eyes as he ordered Nathan's death. The clinical detachment with which he discussed processing Riley once she was captured. Behind these immediate concerns lay knowledge Riley needed: the location of Daniel's base of operations, the extent of his forces, his timeline for recreating the serum. "Helix has a research facility near Bozeman," she stated, reading the information directly from the man's surprise at her knowledge. "That's where Daniel took the data from the mine. How many personnel?" The observer's shock at her apparent mind reading broke his resistance. 30 security, maybe 15 researchers. Porter brought in special equipment after finding the mine, said he'd have preliminary results within 72 hours, which meant they had less than 2 days before Daniel potentially succeeded in synthesizing a new version of the serum. "The other observer," Riley pressed. "South perimeter, we check in every hour." Riley checked her watch. "When's the next check-in?" 20 minutes. That gave them a narrow window to neutralize the second observer and depart before reinforcements arrived. Riley gagged the man with his own bandana and moved to the window, formulating a plan. "We need to take out the other guard," she told Echo. "Then we head for the Helix facility." Echo's response was concern the facility would be heavily secured, their chances of successful infiltration minimal. "We don't need to get inside," Riley clarified. "Clara's neutralizing agent works on biological material. If we can introduce it into their water supply or ventilation system, it will render any serum samples they create inert." It was a desperate plan, but they had limited options, and time was critical. Using her enhanced senses, Riley located the second observer and plotted an approach that would keep Echo hidden until the last moment. She exited the cabin from the rear, circling through the trees while maintaining mental contact with Echo. The second guard was more vigilant than his partner, positioned with good sight lines and minimal exposure. A direct assault would be challenging. Riley opted for deception. Using the captured radio, she mimicked static interference, then spoke in a voice pitched to resemble the first observer's. "Movement at the north corner. Might be our target. Check it out." The second guard hesitated, then responded, "Copy. On my way." As he moved toward the north corner, leaving his protected position, Riley signaled Echo. The horse emerged from the trees behind the man, moving with silent purpose. Before the guard could react to the sound of hoof beats and snow, Echo was upon him, not attacking but creating enough distraction for Riley to close the distance and disable him with a precise strike. With both observers neutralized, Riley gathered essential supplies from the cabin: ammunition, medical equipment, food, and most importantly, the materials needed to synthesize more of Clara's neutralizing agent using the portable lab equipment stored in the hidden chamber. "Time to take the fight to Daniel," she told Echo, securing the last of their supplies. The horse's response was resolute determination, his consciousness aligned perfectly with her own. Together, they disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving behind the cabin that had been both refuge and prison, heading toward a confrontation that would determine not just their own fates, but potentially the future of the technology Clara and Nathan had created so many decades ago. The Helix Research Facility was nestled in a valley 30 miles northeast of Bozeman, its modern architecture incongruous against the rugged Montana landscape. From their vantage point on a forested ridge half a mile away, Riley studied the compound through binoculars, assessing security measures and potential vulnerabilities. The main building was a 3-story glass and steel structure surrounded by a perimeter fence topped with security wire. Guard stations controlled access at 2 points: the main entrance, with its security checkpoint, and a service entrance at the rear where deliveries were processed. Cameras covered the grounds, and armed personnel conducted regular patrols with trained dogs. Not exactly a soft target, Riley murmured to Echo, who stood beside her in the shelter of pine trees. They had traveled through the night to reach this position, pushing their endurance to the limit. The captured satellite phone had proven invaluable, allowing Riley to access detailed maps of the area and limited information about the facility through publicly available databases. Now, as morning light illuminated the valley, she formulated her approach. A frontal assault was out of the question. Even with her military training and enhanced abilities, she couldn't overcome the numerical and technological advantages Helix possessed. But Clara's research had provided an alternative. The neutralizing agent could be aerosolized, introduced into the facility's ventilation system, where it would render any biological samples containing the serum compounds inert. Riley had spent the journey synthesizing a concentrated version of the agent using the portable equipment from Clara's lab. The challenge was delivery. Riley needed to get close enough to access an external air handling unit without being detected by security. Echo projected an observation through their link, a regular delivery truck approaching the facility's service entrance. The vehicle underwent inspection at the gate, then proceeded to a loading dock at the rear of the main building. Perfect, Riley whispered, recognizing the opportunity. She watched the delivery process carefully. The truck remained at the loading dock for approximately 20 minutes, while workers unloaded supplies. Security was present but routine. They checked manifests and occasionally inspected containers, but showed no extraordinary vigilance. Most importantly, the loading dock was adjacent to what appeared to be mechanical systems, large ventilation units that would provide access to the building's air circulation. Riley's plan crystallized. She would need to create a diversion to draw security's attention away from the loading dock, then approach the ventilation systems from the blind spot created by the delivery truck. Echo would be crucial to this strategy, both as the creator of the diversion and as her mental early warning system. They waited until mid-afternoon when the next delivery was scheduled, according to the pattern Riley had observed. As the truck approached the facility, Riley prepared the neutralizing agent in a specialized dispersal device, in essentially a sophisticated smoke bomb that would vaporize the compound into particles small enough to travel through ventilation filters. Remember, she told Echo, securing the device in her pack, your job is to create chaos, not to engage directly. Draw them away from the south perimeter, then circle back to our rendezvous point. Echo's understanding flowed through their connection, along with determination and a touch of what Riley could only interpret as satisfaction at finally confronting those who had caused so much suffering. They moved into position as the delivery truck cleared the security checkpoint. Riley approached from the south using the terrain for cover, while Echo circled to the eastern perimeter where the horse paddocks were located. The facility maintained several horses for what appeared to be recreation or perhaps research purposes, providing Echo with a perfect target for his diversion. Riley checked her watch, counting down to their synchronized action. When the moment came, she sent a mental signal to Echo, then began her careful approach toward the loading dock. Echo's diversion exceeded expectations. The white horse appeared at the paddock fence like an apparition, his presence causing the captive horses to react with immediate agitation. As facility personnel turned their attention toward the commotion, Echo demonstrated abilities far beyond normal equine behavior, opening the paddock gate with his teeth, herding the confused horses into a coordinated mass that overwhelmed the handlers attempting to contain them. Alarms sounded as the horses spilled across the manicured grounds, security personnel abandoning their posts to respond to the chaos. Through her connection with Echo, Riley monitored the diversion while continuing her approach, using the loading dock's blind spots to avoid the few cameras not focused on the horse-related disruption. She reached the ventilation units undetected, quickly identifying the main intake system. The neutralizing device was designed to attach magnetically to the interior of the ductwork, releasing its payload over several hours to ensure complete saturation of the facility's atmosphere. Riley removed an access panel, placed the device inside, and resealed the opening, the entire process taking less than 2 minutes. As she prepared to retreat, her enhanced senses detected a familiar mental signature approaching from inside the building. Daniel Porter. He was moving quickly toward the loading dock, issuing orders to security personnel through a radio. His thoughts projected clearly to Riley's enhanced perception, frustration at the horse incident, suspicion that it might be related to her determination to protect the samples his team had begun processing. Riley had two choices: complete her withdrawal undetected or confront Daniel directly. The former was tactically sound but left Daniel free to continue his pursuit of the Babylon technology. The latter was risky but offered an opportunity to end the threat permanently. She chose confrontation. Positioning herself beside the delivery truck, Riley waited as Daniel emerged onto the loading dock, accompanied by two security officers. His attention was focused on the distant horse paddock where Echo's diversion continued. "Sir, we should get you back inside," one of the officers urged. "We don't know if this is a coordinated attack." "It's her," Daniel replied, scanning the grounds. "Riley Hayes. She's here somewhere." "I'm closer than you think," Riley called, stepping into view with her captured weapon trained on the group. The security officers reached for their sidearms, but Riley's enhanced reflexes gave her the advantage. "Don't," she warned. "I only want to talk to Daniel." Daniel studied her with clinical interest, apparently unconcerned by the weapon aimed at him. "Fascinating," he said. "Your neural integration is progressing rapidly. I can see it in your eyes, the expanded awareness. How are you managing the sensory overload?" "Clara left me more than just memories," Riley replied. "She developed a stabilizer specifically for my neurochemistry." "Of course she did." Daniel nodded appreciatively. "Always the brilliant pragmatist. I'd very much like to analyze that compound." "That's not going to happen," Riley stated flatly. "I've introduced Clara's neutralizing agent into your ventilation system. Within hours, every sample of the serum in this facility will be inert. Project Babylon ends today." For the first time, alarm registered on Daniel's face. "You don't understand what you're doing," he insisted. "The potential benefits—" "Save it," Riley cut him off. "I've read the files. I know what the project did to those children, to Echo, to my parents. No potential benefit justifies those methods." Daniel's expression hardened. "Your idealism is misplaced. The world is more dangerous than ever. Enemies of our nation would not hesitate to develop this technology if given the opportunity. We need to control it before they do." "The same justification used 50 years ago," Riley countered, "leading to the same ethical violations. The cycle ends now." Through her mental link with Echo, Riley sensed the horse disengaging from the diversion, beginning his withdrawal toward their rendezvous point. Their mission was nearly complete. "You've seen what the serum can do," Daniel tried again, gesturing toward her. "The neural bridges you formed with Echo. The enhanced perception, these gifts could help countless people that's suffering from neurological disorders." "Then find another way to develop those treatments," Riley responded. "One that doesn't involve experimental drugs forced on unknowing subjects. One that respects basic human dignity." Daniel's patience visibly thinned. "And what about you, Riley? The neutralizing agent will affect your neural pathways as well. Are you prepared to lose your connection to Echo to return to isolation?" The question struck at Riley's deepest uncertainty. The bond with Echo had become central to her existence in a remarkably short time. To sever it would be to lose a part of herself. "That's my choice to make," she said finally. "Not yours, not the military's, not even Clara's. For the first time since I was 3 years old, I get to decide what happens to my own mind." Movement in her peripheral awareness alerted Riley to approaching security personnel reinforcements responding to the situation at the loading dock. Her window for clean escape was closing rapidly. "It's over, Daniel," she said, beginning a calculated withdrawal while maintaining her aim. "Find a new project." Daniel's expression showed neither acceptance nor defeat, but rather the cold calculation of a man already formulating the alternatives. "This is only a setback," he replied. "The data still exists. The principle is proven. It's just a matter of time." "Then I'll be watching," Riley promised, reaching the edge of the loading dock where her escape route waited. "We all will be." She disappeared over the edge just as additional security forces arrived, dropping into the drainage culvert that ran beneath the facility's perimeter. The neutralizing agent was deployed. Echo was safely away, and she had delivered her message directly to Daniel. Mission parameters achieved. As Riley navigated the drainage system toward her extraction point, she reflected on Daniel's parting words. He was right about one thing: this wasn't truly over. The knowledge couldn't be unlearned. The potential of the technology couldn't be erased completely. Eternal vigilance would be the price of ensuring Project Babylon never claimed more victims. Echo was waiting at their predetermined rendezvous point, his white coat ghostly in the gathering dusk. As Riley approached their mental connection, strengthened shared satisfaction at their success mingling with uncertainty about what would come next. "We did it," she told him, resting her forehead against his. "But Daniel's right, the neutralizing agent will affect me too, eventually. Our connection." Echo's response was complex, not resignation but acceptance, a certainty that what they had shared would not be truly lost even if the neural bridge between them faded. Some bonds transcended the physical mechanisms that created them. Riley mounted, and they moved deeper into the forest, away from the Helix facility and the road networks that Daniel would soon have monitored. They had struck a significant blow against Project Babylon's resurrection, but they remained vulnerable. Until they could be certain the threat was neutralized, they would need to remain mobile, vigilant, and hidden. As night fell over the Montana wilderness, Riley Hayes and Echo disappeared into the darkness. Their shared consciousness, a beacon that defied the isolation both had known before their paths converged. Whatever the future held, whether continued connection or eventual separation, they faced it not as experimental, subject and test animal, but as partners united by choice rather than science. 1 year later, the mountain meadow bloomed with wildflowers, their colors vibrant against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks. Riley Hayes sat on the porch of a small cabin, not her grandmother's, which had been compromised, but a new sanctuary established far from any official record. Beside her, Echo grazed contentedly, his white coat gleaming in the summer sunshine. The past year had brought significant changes. The neutralizing agent had indeed affected Riley's enhanced abilities, but not as completely as Daniel had predicted. Her connection with Echo remained, though, transformed, less direct neural linkage and more intuitive understanding, a bond forged through shared experience rather than imposed by chemistry. Clara's research had provided answers to questions Riley had carried her entire life. The headaches and sensory anomalies she had experienced since childhood, diagnosed as migraine disorder by military doctors, had actually been manifestations of her altered neurology attempting to form connections. The nightmares following Afghanistan, the hypervigilance diagnosed as PTSD, while partially trauma response, these had also been her enhanced perceptions trying to emerge through the barriers of normal consciousness. Understanding brought a measure of peace. Riley still carried the scars of combat, still mourned Sarah and Nathan and her parents, but she no longer felt fundamentally broken. Different, yes, altered in ways she hadn't chosen but not damaged beyond repair. In the months following their confrontation at the Helix facility, Riley had used Clara's research and her own unique perspective to develop a comprehensive understanding of Project Babylon. Using secure channels established through trusted contacts from her military days, she had released sanitized versions of the evidence to key oversight committees in Congress and independent watchdog organizations. The resulting investigations had severely curtailed Helix Corporation's operations. Daniel Porter had avoided prosecution through legal maneuvering and powerful connections, but his reputation was damaged, his access to government contracts severely limited. Most importantly, the scrutiny had forced the company to abandon any research related to neural manipulation technology. A more personal victory had come 6 months after the Helix confrontation, when Riley's discreet monitoring of intelligence channels revealed that Helix's board of directors had removed Daniel from his position, citing ethical concerns about his research methodologies. The man who had imprisoned Nathan, who had been willing to sacrifice lives for his ambition, had been rendered professionally impotent. Echo's awareness brushed against Riley's consciousness, a gentle reminder that she had been lost in thought for some time. The connection between them had evolved into something neither Clara nor the original Babylon researchers could have predicted, not the imposed bridge of the serum, but something organic that had grown from shared purpose and mutual choice. Riley reached out to stroke Echo's muzzle, feeling the familiar warmth of his presence in her mind. "We did good, didn't we?" she asked softly. The horse nickered in response, projecting agreement tinged with contentment. In the years since their escape from Helix, Echo had thrived. His injuries fully healed his coat, regaining the lustrous quality visible in Clara's old photographs. Veterinarians who had examined him discreetly under false identification had been astonished by his condition, estimating his age at perhaps 15. rather than his actual 60-plus years. Another legacy of Project Babylon's cellular regeneration that had extended Echo's lifespan far beyond normal parameters, a benefit amid so much harm. Riley's attention was drawn to movement at the edge of the meadow, a small herd of wild horses emerging from the tree line. At their head trotted a dun mare with whom Echo had formed a particular attachment in recent months. Behind her pranced a gangly foal, its coat a distinctive pale cream marked with subtle gray dappling. Echo's foal, a miracle no one had anticipated. The scientists of Project Babylon had believed their male subjects rendered sterile by the serum treatments. Yet here was living proof of their miscalculation, a new generation carrying some genetic trace of the original experiments. The foal broke away from its mother, galloping awkwardly toward Echo with the exuberance of youth. As it approached, Riley felt a whisper of awareness, not the full neural connection she shared with Echo, but something nascent, a potential that might develop with time. She had named the foal legacy a reminder of both the burdens and gifts they carried forward. Whatever altered genetics the young horse inherited remained to be seen, but Riley was committed to ensuring it would grow up free from exploitation, its nature allowed to develop without interference. The satellite phone in the cabin chirped the secure line Riley maintained for emergency communications. She rose from her seat on the porch, giving Echo a parting pat before going inside to answer. The call was brief but significant. Her contact in military intelligence reported that Daniel Porter had been observed boarding a private jet bound for Eastern Europe, carrying digital storage devices, and traveling under an assumed identity. Facial recognition at his destination airport had matched him entering a building owned by a pharmaceutical corporation with known ties to foreign military research. Daniel hadn't given up. He was taking his knowledge elsewhere, seeking new sponsors for his ambitions. Riley ended the call considering the implications. She had known this day might come, that the threat wouldn't end with Helix's downfall. Daniel's obsession with Project Babylon ran too deep for him to simply abandon it. She returned to the porch where Echo waited, his awareness already attuned to her concern. The young foal frolicked nearby, unaware of the legacy it carried or the potential dangers that legacy might attract. "Looks like our work isn't finished," Riley told Echo, running her hand along his neck. "Daniel's gone international. We need to track him, make sure he can't restart the project under different sponsors." Echo's response was immediate willingness, his consciousness aligning with hers in shared purpose. After a year of relative peace, the prospect of renewed conflict should have dismayed them both. Instead, Riley felt a strange sense of rightness, as if this was the mission they had been preparing for all along. Clara had understood this eventuality. Her final journal entry, which Riley had discovered among the research materials from the hidden laboratory, had been explicit. The knowledge can never be truly destroyed. The responsibility for containing it passes to you, Riley. You and Echo are the guardians, now the only ones who truly understand what's at stake. Riley gazed out across the meadow where Echo's foal played in the summer sunshine, embodying both promise and risk. The burden Clara had described wasn't just about preventing the misuse of the Babylon technology. It was about protecting those who, like Riley herself, had been altered without consent, and those who, like Legacy, carried the unexpected consequences of those alterations into a new generation. "We'll leave tomorrow," she decided, the plan already forming in her mind. Her military contacts could provide transportation to Europe. The neural enhancement that remained, though diminished, would still give her advantages in tracking Daniel's movements. And Echo's presence would ensure she never faced the darkness alone. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Riley Hayes watched Echo interact with his unexpected offspring, their movements synchronized in ways that spoke of connection deeper than training or instinct. Whatever came next, whatever challenges Daniel Porter or others like him might present, they would face them together, bound not by the serum that had altered them, but by the choices they had made in its aftermath. In that moment, Riley understood what Clara had perhaps known all along. The true legacy of Project Babylon wasn't the neural technology or the enhanced capabilities it created. It was the demonstration that connection between species, between generations, between minds, that should never have been able to touch, transcended the clinical boundaries of science. Echo returned to her side as the evening approached, his consciousness brushing against hers with now familiar warmth. Together they watched the wild herd gather their foals, including Legacy, preparing to return to the sheltering forest for the night. Sleep well, Riley murmured to the departing foal. We'll keep watch. The young horse paused, looking back at them, with eyes that seemed to hold understanding beyond its weeks of life. Then it turned, following its mother into the trees, disappearing into shadows that grew long across the meadow. Riley and Echo remained on the porch as stars emerged in the darkening sky, sentinels standing guard not just over a specific place or person, but over a principle that some knowledge demanded eternal vigilance, that some bonds transcended the mechanisms that created them, and that true healing began with the freedom to choose one's own path forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a renewed pursuit of Daniel Porter and his dangerous ambitions. But tonight, in this peaceful meadow, far from the traumas that had shaped them both, Riley Hayes and Echo shared something their creators had never anticipated. Not just connection, but communion. A meeting of minds that had begun as an experiment, but had evolved into something science could neither fully explain nor control. Perhaps that in the end was their greatest victory against Project Babylon, not destroying the knowledge it had created, but transforming it into something its architects had never imagined, a partnership of equals chosen rather than imposed, healing rather than exploiting. As darkness settled completely over the mountains, Riley felt Echo's consciousness settle alongside her own, watchful, steadfast, and above all, free. Whatever tomorrow might bring, that freedom, hard-won and fiercely protected, would remain their most precious achievement. They say the deepest scars are the ones we cannot see, the alterations made without consent, the connections forged in darkness. Riley Hayes came to the mountains seeking isolation, believing silence would heal what war had broken. Instead, she found her voice in the whispers of a horse who had waited half a century to deliver his message. Together, they unearthed buried truths and faced those who would weaponize connection itself. They stood against the cold calculation that values progress over humanity, power over consent. What remains when the battles end is not victory, but choice. The freedom to decide one's own path. The courage to protect others from suffering endured. In the meadow where Echo's foal now plays, Riley understands what her grandmother knew all along, that true healing comes not from separation, but from bonds freely chosen. That the legacy we guard is not measured in scientific breakthroughs, but in the dignity we preserve for those who come after us. As twilight settles over the mountains, her hand rests on Echo's neck, sentinel and guardian, wounded healer, protector of possibilities yet unwritten. For in the space between minds, in the connection between species, in the silence between heartbeats, there lies the most powerful question of all. What would you sacrifice to protect another's right to choose their own story?